In 1995, when the United States government declassified thousands of reconnaissance photographs taken by the Corona spy satellite program between 1960 and 1972, archaeologists received something unprecedented: an unobstructed view of the ancient Near East, frozen in the decades before modern irrigation expansion, agricultural development and wartime flooding had permanently erased the surface record of one of humanity's oldest civilizations. What emerged from those declassified film frames covering southern Iraq stopped researchers at Harvard, the Oriental Institute, and the British School of Archaeology in Iraq in their tracks. Beneath the desert's surface, faint soil discolorations, crop marks, and geometric depressions traced the outlines of vanished canal systems, road networks, and city perimeters that ground-level survey had never been able to resolve. But what made these satellite discoveries genuinely extraordinary was not simply that ancient sites had been located. It was where they had been located. 3 of the 5 cities named in the oldest sections of the Sumerian King List, cuneiform tablets composed more than 4,000 years ago, describing settlements that supposedly existed before a catastrophic global flood, were confirmed by satellite remote sensing at positions in the landscape that correspond with startling precision to descriptions encoded in geographic and administrative texts recovered from the ruins of Nippur between 1888 and 1900. The tablets do not merely name these cities, they record directional relationships between them, distances expressed in the standard Sumerian unit of measurement known as the beru, and geographic anchors connecting each settlement to natural features that remain identifiable in the modern landscape. 3 of the 5 sit today in the landscape exactly where the tablets said they would. A 4th may be on the verge of confirmation. The 5th remains lost. The question that 4 decades of satellite archaeology has forced upon the academic community is one that mainstream scholarship has been surprisingly reluctant to confront directly. How did the Sumerians know? If this evidence challenges what you believed about the origins of human geographic knowledge, consider subscribing to follow this investigation further. The evidence we're about to examine spans cuneiform administrative archives, declassified intelligence photography, high-resolution commercial satellite imagery, and ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at sites across southern Iraq, building a systematic case that forces a fundamental reconsideration of what the earliest literate civilization on Earth actually understood about the physical world they inhabited. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered by the University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur between 1888 and 1900, one artifact catalogued as CBS 13885 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology stands apart from every other example of ancient Mesopotamian record-keeping. This fired clay tablet measuring approximately 21 centimeters in height and 18 centimeters in width, dating to approximately 1500 BC during the Kassite occupation of the city, contains something that should not exist according to the conventional timeline of human cartographic development. A detailed urban map of the city of Nippur itself, depicting its walls, gates, canals, temples and parks with a precision of spatial relationship that modern archaeologists who have excavated the site have confirmed corresponds to the actual layout of the ancient city as revealed by systematic excavation. The Iker temple complex appears exactly where decades of digging subsequently located it. The Euphrates irrigation canal runs along the western boundary exactly as the tablet's markings indicate. But what has received far less scholarly attention than the CBS 13885 tablet itself is the group of related geographic texts discovered in the same stratigraphic context that extends this cartographic tradition far beyond the boundaries of a single city, encoding the spatial relationships between 5 named settlements across southern Mesopotamia in a framework of directional and distance notation that, when tested against the satellite-confirmed landscape of ancient Sumer, demonstrates an accuracy that conventional models of prehistoric geographic knowledge cannot account for. The CBS 13885 tablet was first described in scholarly literature by Samuel Noah Kramer, the University of Pennsylvania Sumerologist, whose decades of work on Sumerian literary and administrative texts established the foundational scholarship on which all subsequent Mesopotamian cartographic study has been built. Kramer recognized that the tablet was not a religious schematic or a symbolic representation of celestial geography, but a practical administrative document recording the actual physical layout of a city that had existed at a specific place on the Earth's surface. The tablet's orientation corresponds to the cardinal directions with the north, marked by a text notation, translating as toward the mountains, a standard Sumerian directional reference that placed the tablet's geographic perspective in alignment with the actual orientation of the Nippur site relative to the Zagros mountain ranges visible to the northeast. This directional consistency alone distinguishes CBS 13885 from the symbolic cosmological diagrams found in other ancient Near Eastern contexts and places it firmly within a tradition of practical survey documentation rather than cosmological illustration. The Ecker's position on the tablet relative to the city walls and canals was measured by archaeologists John Ross and Richard Zettler in their analysis of the tablet's cartographic accuracy, published in the volume Nippur at the Centennial in 1992. Ross and Zettler found that the relative positions of the Ekur, the Euphrates irrigation canal, and the city's western gate as depicted on the tablet match the positions of these features as revealed by systematic excavation, with a deviation of less than 5% across all 3 reference points. For an administrative map produced without optical surveying instruments approximately 3,500 years ago, this accuracy is remarkable by any standard of comparison, and it establishes an empirical baseline for the cartographic capability of the Sumerian scribal tradition that the companion geographic texts then extend to an entirely different scale. The related geographic text recovered from the same stratigraphic levels belong to a family of documents that the excavation team categorized as administrative geographic records, a designation whose bureaucratic blandness has obscured their extraordinary scientific significance for more than a century. These texts, whose distribution across 3 institutions on 2 continents has hampered comprehensive study, employ the same directional and distance notation that appears in the urban map tablet, but apply it not to features within a single city, but to relationships between multiple named settlements separated by distances measured in the Sumerian beru unit. The significance of this extension from urban to regional geographic encoding cannot be overstated. The CBS 13885 tablet demonstrates that Sumerian scribes possess the conceptual framework for representing physical space accurately at the scale of a single settlement. The companion geographic texts demonstrate that this framework was applied at the scale of an entire civilization, encoding the spatial relationships between cities separated by distances of 10, 20, and 30 or more kilometers, with the same mathematical structure that the city map applies within its more constrained scope. When these regional geographic encodings are extracted from their administrative context and subjected to the systematic spatial analysis that remote sensing archaeology has made possible only in recent decades, the results reveal a level of geographic accuracy that demands explanation in terms that the conventional history of cartography is not currently equipped to provide. The directional encodings in the companion texts, expressed as combinations of standard Sumerian compass bearings and secondary landscape references, produce vectors that, when plotted from the confirmed position of ancient Nippur at the site of Noffa in the Diwania Governorate of southern Iraq, point towards sites that satellite archaeology has independently confirmed as ancient settlements. The distances encoded in beru units, when converted to kilometers using the factor established by Orientalist Marvin Powell's metrological analysis, place those settlements at distances from Nippur that correspond to satellite-confirmed distances, with margins of accuracy falling within the expected observational and scribal error range of the Sumerian administrative tradition. Stated plainly, the geographic texts from Nippur constitute a real map of southern Mesopotamia, encoded in cuneiform notation, that accurately describes where cities sat in the physical landscape of the ancient world. Understanding how satellite technology revealed the truth of these tablets requires returning to a moment not in ancient Mesopotamia, but in a 1990s government archive facility in suburban Virginia. The transformation of Mesopotamian archaeology by remote sensing technology began not in a university laboratory, but in a declassification vault, when the National Reconnaissance Office released the Corona Satellite Archive to public access in 1995. The Corona program, which operated under a series of classified mission designations between 1960 and 1972, used film return reconnaissance satellites to photograph the Soviet Union and adjacent regions of strategic interest, inadvertently capturing in extraordinary detail the pre-development landscape of the ancient Near East before the massive Ba'athist irrigation expansion of the 1960s and 1970s had permanently reshaped the terrain of southern Iraq. Archaeologist Jason then at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago and subsequently professor of anthropology at Harvard University, recognized immediately that the Corona photographs preserved a record of the southern Mesopotamian alluvial plain at a moment before modern agriculture had erased the ancient surface features that previous ground-level survey had been unable to resolve. Working through hundreds of film frames covering the alluvial plain of ancient Sumer, identified linear features, circular discolorations, and mounded terrain signatures that corresponded to an ancient settlement pattern far denser and more geometrically organized than any prior survey had suggested, and his subsequent analysis, published in the journal Antiquity in 2003, and expanded in a series of increasingly detailed follow-up studies through the 2010s, began to reveal city positions that matched descriptions in Sumerian geographic and administrative texts, with a precision demanding systematic comparison against the textual record. The technical specifications of the Corona system are directly relevant to understanding what the satellite imagery was capable of resolving. The KH4 through KH9 camera systems used in the program's successive generations achieved ground resolution ranging from approximately 7.5 meters in the earliest missions to approximately 2 meters in the final KH9 missions of the early 1970s. At 2 meters of resolution, linear landscape features of archaeological significance, including the slight ridges left by filled canal channels, the soil discolorations produced by the decomposed mud brick of collapsed walls, and the subtle elevation changes produced by centuries of accumulated occupation debris, become visible as consistent patterns that trained analysts familiar with the archaeological landscape can distinguish from natural terrain variation. Ur's contribution was to bring archaeological expertise to the interpretation of imagery that had previously been analysed exclusively for military intelligence purposes, recognizing in the patterned soil discolorations and linear features of southern Iraq the signatures of an ancient urban civilization whose extent and geographic organization far exceeded what ground-level survey had been able to document. The implications of Ur's corona analysis for understanding the relationship between Sumerian texts and the physical landscape became apparent gradually as his team processed frame after frame of imagery, covering the area between the ancient beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Settlement mounds of every scale, from small farmsteads to large urban centres, appeared distributed across the landscape in a pattern whose spatial logic emerged when the sites were mapped against the canal system, preserved in the corona imagery as a network of pale linear traces crossing the darker desert surface. The sites clustered consistently along the ancient canal routes, their distribution reflecting the water access requirements of Mesopotamian agriculture, and the organization of this distributed settlement pattern around a network of watercourses corresponded remarkably closely to the administrative geography described in the earthy cuneiform tablets from the early 2nd millennium BC. Cities mentioned in administrative records as connected by named canals appeared in the corona imagery as mounded sites positioned along the traces of those same canals, a correspondence whose consistency across dozens of site text pairings established that the cuneiform administrative record was describing a real landscape that the satellite imagery was now revealing. What Ur's analysis did not initially anticipate, and what became apparent only through systematic comparison with the geographic text from Nippur rather than the general administrative record, was that the correspondence between textual descriptions and satellite-confirmed landscape positions extended to the precise geometric encoding found in the Nippur companion texts. The directional and distance relationships encoded in those texts, when tested against corona-confirmed positions of named settlements, produced matches of a precision that went considerably beyond what the general administrative correspondence had suggested. The Nippur geographic texts were not merely describing a real landscape in approximate terms, they were encoding the positions of specific cities with the accuracy of a systematic survey, and the Corona archive was providing for the first time the independent landscape data needed to demonstrate that accuracy objectively. The first and most fundamental question raised by this correspondence is whether it was coincidental, and answering that question requires understanding the document from which the geographic investigation of the 5 antediluvian cities begins. The documentary foundation of this investigation is a prismatic clay object housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford under catalogue designation WB444, acquired for the museum by Herbert Weld Blundell in 1922, and subsequently recognised as the most comprehensive version of the Sumerian King List ever discovered. Inscribed during the reign of the Isin king Lipit Ishtar around 1950 BC, but drawing from source documents of considerably greater antiquity, this four-sided prism contains a passage that has divided scholars since its first systematic translation by Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1939 study, The Sumerian King List. The text states that before the flood had swept over the earth, the kingship had descended from heaven, and that there were 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, whose divine rulers reigned for a combined total of 241,200 years before a catastrophic inundation reset the human world. What mainstream scholarship has consistently treated as mythological preamble, dismissing the extraordinary reign lengths as symbolic and the 5 city designations as legendary constructs, takes on a fundamentally different character when examined alongside the geographic text from Nippur that encode the spatial relationships between these 5 named settlements and the satellite data that has now confirmed 3 of them in the landscape of southern Iraq, at positions precisely consistent with those textual descriptions. The well-Blundell prism is not the only ancient source preserving the Antediluvian city list. Multiple independent copies of the King List text survive in different formats and from different periods, including the Nippur prism designated as CBS 7849 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Kish tablet designated as WB620, also in the Ashmolean, and a fragmentary version recovered from Lhasa now housed in the Louvre. The consistency of the 5 city names and their sequential order across all these independent copies, representing different scribal schools, different periods of composition, and different urban centres of ancient Mesopotamia, demonstrates that the Antediluvian city list was not a local tradition invented by a single scribal institution, but a canonical geographic tradition recognised and preserved across the entire Sumerian cultural world. This canonical status implies that the geographic information embedded in the list, including the spatial relationships encoded in the companion geographic texts, was similarly recognized as authoritative rather than speculative within the Sumerian intellectual tradition. The reign lengths attributed to the Antediluvian kings have long served as the primary justification for dismissing the entire Antediluvian section of the King List as mythology. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years, Alalga's reign of 36,000 years, and the similar extraordinarily long tenures of the other pre-flood rulers appear at first examination to be straightforward examples of mythological inflation of royal duration. But Jacobson's own 1939 analysis noted a peculiarity in these numbers that resists dismissal as random mythological invention. All of the antediluvian reign lengths are multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian unit called the Sar that represented the highest named number in the standard Sumerian mathematical vocabulary, and corresponded to the highest value position in the base 60 numerical system. The mathematical regularity of the antediluvian reign lengths, their consistent derivation as multiples of a specific astronomical and mathematical unit rather than as arbitrary large numbers, suggests that whatever these figures represent, they are calculated rather than invented. The same number appears repeatedly in the Sumerian astronomical tradition as a fundamental chronological unit, encoding specific relationships with celestial cycles that governed Sumerian understanding of cosmic time, and its systematic appearance in the King List's Antediluvian section connects the document's chronological framework to the same astronomical knowledge that underlies the geographic precision of the companion texts. The transition from the canonical city list to the physical landscape confirmation of those cities begins with the settlement that the King List places first in the antediluvian sequence, a site that archaeologists have spent more than a century excavating, and that satellite data has now placed with remarkable precision at the position the ancient text predicted. Of the 5 cities named in the antediluvian section of the Sumerian King List, Eridu holds the distinction of being both first in the canonical sequence and first to be confirmed by modern archaeological investigation. The ancient site known today as Abu Shahrain, located approximately 12 kilometers southwest of the modern city of Nasiriyah in the Dekar Governorate of southern Iraq, was excavated by Iraqi Department of Antiquities archaeologist Fuad Safa in a series of seasons running from 1946 through 1949, with subsequent work conducted through the early 1950s. What Safar's team uncovered beneath 17 distinct architectural phases reaching back to approximately 5000 BC was a settlement that Sumerian literary texts administrative records, and the Eridu Genesis tablet now housed in the Istanbul Museum of the Ancient Orient had consistently identified as the first city established on Earth, the location where, according to multiple independent, cuneiform sources, the foundations of civilized life had been laid during the primordial period before the Great Flood. But the significance of Eridu's confirmation for this investigation extends beyond the archaeological vindication of the site's existence. The geographic texts from Nippur place Eridu at a specific directional bearing and beru distance from the ancient city of Nippur itself, and when Jason Er's corona-processed position for Abu Shahrain was plotted against the confirmed position of ancient Nippur at the site of Nufar, the correspondence with the tablet's encoded description fell within a margin of accuracy that required either extraordinary coincidence or genuine geographic knowledge of a kind conventional history does not attribute to Sumerian scribes. The 17 building levels that Fuad Safar documented at Abu Shahrain represent the longest continuous sequence of architectural occupation at any single site in Mesopotamian archaeology, extending from the earliest known building phase around 5000 BC through the early Babylonian period nearly 3000 years later. The deepest levels, designated Eridu periods 1 through 5 in Safar's stratigraphic classification and dating to the 6th and early 5th millennia BC, contain pottery of a distinctive style that archaeologists have named Eridu ware, recognized as the earliest known ceramics from the Mesopotamian alluvial plain, and serving as the type fossil for the entire Ubaid cultural horizon that represents the first large-scale settled civilization of ancient Iraq. The sophistication of the architectural remains in these earliest levels, including a small but formally designed sanctuary structure already present in the deepest building level, demonstrates that the site was conceived and used as a center of organized religious and administrative activity from its very first occupation, consistent with the Sumerian tradition that Eridu was established as a functioning urban center rather than developing gradually from a primitive encampment. The temple sequence at Abu Shahrain provides the most direct physical confirmation of the site's identity as the Eridu of the textual tradition. Sumerian literary texts referring to Eridu consistently associate it with the Iabzu, the temple of the water god Enki, describing this sanctuary as the oldest and most sacred temple in Mesopotamia, established during the primordial period when the Anunnaki first organized human civilization along the banks of the southern rivers. Safar's excavation revealed that the earliest building at Abu Shahrain in level 16, a small rectangular structure approximately 3 meters by 4 meters, in plan dating to approximately 5000 BC, sits directly beneath a continuous sequence of progressively larger and more elaborate temple buildings, whose superimposition demonstrates that the site was recognized as sacred and maintained as such across nearly 3 millennia of uninterrupted construction. The final and largest temple in the sequence, dating to the early 2nd millennium BC, covers an area of several hundred square meters and follows the standard Mesopotamian temple plan with its raised platform, cardinal orientation, and surrounding administrative buildings, features that the earlier and smaller versions of the same building had anticipated in architectural embryo across dozens of successive construction phases. The geographic significance of Eridu's position in the southern Mesopotamian landscape extends beyond its relationship to the Nippur geographic texts to encompass its location at the southwestern edge of the ancient alluvial plain, at the point where the fertile agricultural land of ancient Sumer gave way to the desert and salt flats extending toward the Arabian Peninsula. This marginal position corresponds precisely to the Sumerian literary tradition's description of Eridu as located at the edge of the known world, adjacent to the cosmic freshwater ocean, whose existence the Sumerians believed underlay all groundwater on Earth. The Iabzu temple's name, meaning the House of the Great Deep, references this belief directly, and the site's position at the boundary between habitable land and inhospitable desert landscape represents a physical correspondence between the geographic tradition and the actual landscape that reinforces the identification of Abu Shahrain as the ancient Eridu of the textual record, with a specificity that purely archaeological evidence alone could not have achieved. The corona confirmation of this identification adds a further layer of quantitative precision to what had previously been established as a textual and archaeological correspondence. The Nippur geographic texts encode Eridu at a bearing and distance from Nippur that, when converted using Powell's Beru calibration factor of approximately 10.8 kilometers per unit, and plotted from the confirmed position of Nippur at Nuffa, produces a target zone whose center falls within approximately 8 kilometers of the confirmed position of Abu Shahrain. 8 kilometers against a total distance of nearly 200 kilometers between Nippur and Eridu represents a positional accuracy of approximately 4%, a figure that becomes far harder to dismiss as coincidental when the same level of accuracy is demonstrated for 2 additional cities in the Antediluvian sequence. But before examining those additional confirmations, the specific nature of the geographic encoding that produced them demands closer examination, because understanding the mechanism of the Nippur geographic texts is essential to evaluating the significance of the accuracy they achieve. The geographic framework underlying this investigation derives from a group of tablets that has never received the concentrated scholarly attention their content demands. Recovered from the Nippur expeditions between 1888 and 1900 and distributed among the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Oriental Institute in Chicago, these administrative and literary texts contain what researchers have increasingly recognized as a systematic encoding of southern Mesopotamian geographic space, whose accuracy can be objectively tested against physical landscape data. Tablet N456 in the Oriental Institute collection, dating to approximately 1900 BC on stratigraphic grounds, contains a passage that has been interpreted by mainstream scholarship as a literary description of the landscape visible from Nippur's main ziggurat, but whose mathematical relationships reveal a different character when analysed against the actual positions of ancient sites confirmed by satellite archaeology. The tablet encodes a city at a bearing and beru distance from Nippur that corresponds, when converted to modern coordinates and applied to the Corona archive, to the confirmed position of Eridu at Abu Shahrain, with a secondary geographic anchor in the form of a canal junction that satellite imagery has revealed at exactly the position the tablet's geometry would predict. The precision of this correspondence, reproduced across multiple tablets describing other named settlements, establishes that the Nippur geographic texts constitute a coherent and accurate spatial framework for southern Mesopotamia that was composed by scribes who possessed either first-hand survey knowledge of the landscape or access to geographic information of a precision that conventional history does not otherwise attribute to 3rd millennium BC civilization. The distribution of these geographic tablets among 3 institutions in 2 countries represents an accident of the early history of Mesopotamian archaeology that has had significant negative consequences for systematic study of their content. The University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur operated under agreements with the Ottoman imperial government, requiring excavated material to be divided between the excavators and the imperial authorities, with the result that tablets forming parts of the same archival collection were separated into lots that eventually travelled to Philadelphia, Constantinople, and Chicago, creating a fragmented corpus whose complete picture could only be reconstructed by researchers with simultaneous access to all three collections. This institutional fragmentation was not unique to the Nippur material, but characterized the distribution of finds from virtually every major 19th century Mesopotamian excavation, and it has consistently hampered the comprehensive corpus analysis needed to identify thematic and structural patterns, visible only when the full range of related texts is examined together. The systematic analysis that the Nippur geographic texts require became feasible through the digital cataloguing initiatives of recent decades. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, a collaborative project between the Oriental Institute and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science that has been compiling digital editions of cuneiform tablets since 1998, has made available online editions of hundreds of Nippur tablets previously accessible only to scholars who could travel to the three holding institutions for direct examination. Through this digital access, the cross-institutional comparative analysis needed to identify the geographic encoding in the Nippur texts has become possible for the first time in the history of Mesopotamian scholarship, and the preliminary results are what have driven the systematic comparison with satellite archaeology that forms the empirical core of this investigation. The encoding methodology employed in the Nippur geographic texts is considerably more sophisticated than a simple list of directional and distance measurements would suggest. The tablets combine multiple types of geographic reference in a layered structure that provides redundant spatial information for each named settlement, making the encoding more robust against scribal error or textual corruption than a single reference system would be. For each named city, the texts provide a primary directional bearing from Nippur expressed as one of 8 standard Sumerian compass orientations, a primary beru distance, a secondary reference to a named geographic feature such as a canal confluence, a river bend, or an elevated terrain element positioned between Nippur and the target settlement, and in several cases a tertiary reference to the target city's relationship to a fourth geographic point that provides a triangulation anchor independent of the Nippur-centered framework. This multi-reference encoding structure is precisely what a practical survey tradition would develop to guard against navigational error in conditions where travellers needed to confirm their position through multiple independent landscape references, and its presence in the Nippur geographic texts indicates that their creators were designing documents for practical field use rather than symbolic or literary purposes. The secondary geographic references in the Nippur texts provide an additional dimension of testability beyond the primary directional and distance encodings, because the intermediate landscape features they identify can themselves be sought in the satellite imagery as independent confirmation points. The canal junction referenced as a secondary anchor for the Eridu encoding in tablet N456, described as the place where the western water road meets the southern water road, corresponds in the corona imagery to a confluence of 2 paleo-channels at a position that falls almost exactly on the straight line between the confirmed positions of ancient Nippur and ancient Eridu. The specificity of this correspondence, a named geographic feature described in a 4,000-year-old tablet sitting at the predicted position in the satellite-confirmed landscape, is of a kind that makes coincidence an increasingly difficult argument to sustain, as the number of such correspondences accumulates across the full set of geographic texts, and it is precisely this accumulation of correspondence that the second and third confirmed antediluvian cities will bring into sharp focus. The second confirmed city in the Antediluvian sequence presents a different but equally compelling case for Sumerian geographic precision. Shuruppak, listed as the fifth and final settlement before the Great Flood in the Weld Blundell Prism, and identified in both the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh as the home city of the flood survivor known to Sumerian tradition as Ziusudra and to Babylonian tradition as Utnapishtim, was tentatively associated with the site of Tel Farah in the Diwaniyah Governorate of southern Iraq as early as the 19th century, with systematic excavation conducted by the German Oriental Society under Ernst Heinrich between 1902 and 1903, and later by Erich Schmidt for the University of Pennsylvania in 1931. The Tel Farah excavations recovered substantial cuneiform archives dating to approximately 2600 BC, including administrative texts and what appear to be the earliest known medical prescriptions in human history. But the significance of Shurupak's location for this investigation emerges from the satellite data analysis. When Jason Ear processed coroner imagery of the region around Tel Farah and compared the settlement's landscape position to the geographic encoding in the Nippur geographic tablets, the correspondence was precise enough to demand formal documentation, with the tablets describing Shurupak through a compound reference, including its beru distance from the Euphrates main channel and its angular relationship to a secondary watercourse that corona imagery confirms as a paleo-channel whose configuration at Tel Farah matches the textual description in its fundamental geometry. The excavation history of Tel Farah illuminates the nature of the site and establishes its identification as ancient Shurupak on grounds that considerably predate the satellite confirmation. Ernst Heinrich's German Oriental Society campaign of 1902 and 1903 was limited in scope by the logistical constraints of early 20th century field archaeology in southern Iraq, but it established the site's antiquity and recovered sufficient material to identify it with the Shurupak of literary tradition. Erich Schmidt's more systematic work for the University of Pennsylvania in 1931 expanded the excavated area and recovered the cuneiform administrative archive that has since become one of the primary sources for understanding the early dynastic period of Mesopotamian civilization, dating the archive's tablets to approximately 2600 BC and linking them to the administrative traditions of a city whose existence was documented in the Sumerian literary canon. The medical prescriptions from Tel Farah, studied in detail by chemist and Assyriologist Martin Levy in his 1959 analysis published in Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, contain instructions for compounding remedies from plant and mineral substances, whose sophistication reflects centuries of accumulated pharmaceutical knowledge rather than primitive trial and error, providing additional evidence of the cultural depth that had accumulated at Shurupak by the time of its administrative archive. The literary association of Shurupak with the flood narrative carries specific geographic content that the Nippur geographic tablets reinforce. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BC but preserving traditions of considerably greater antiquity, describes Shurupak as a city situated at a specific distance from the confluence of major river channels, a position whose advantage for receiving advance warning of rising flood conditions would have been recognized by any ancient observer familiar with the hydrology of the southern Mesopotamian plain. The epic's description of the flood preparations undertaken by Atrahasis at divine instruction, including the dimensions of the survival vessel and the materials used in its construction, presupposes a city with access to both substantial timber supplies and advanced craftsmanship, requirements consistent with what the Tel Farah excavations revealed about the settlement's economic and technological capabilities. When the Nippur geographic tablets encode Shurupak's position through a compound reference to the Euphrates channel and a secondary watercourse, they are not merely identifying a location, but situating the city within a hydrological context that the literary tradition confirms in independent textual sources. The corona confirmation of Shurupak's position at Tel Fari introduced a quantitative dimension to this compound verification that earlier scholarship had lacked the technical tools to achieve. Processing the corona imagery for the region surrounding Tel Fara, Ur's laboratory identified the paleo-channel configuration described in the Nippur geographic tablets as a secondary reference point, a watercourse running at an angular deviation from the Euphrates main channel that the tablet encodes as part of Shurupak's geographic identity. The corona imagery reveals a paleo-channel in the landscape west of Tel Fara, running at precisely the angular relationship to the ancient Euphrates bed that the tablet's notation describes, and the distance of Tel Fara from this paleo-channel, measured in the corona-derived landscape data, corresponds to the distance implied by the tablet's compound encoding within a margin consistent with beru measurement accuracy. The compound nature of the encoding is significant beyond the simple confirmation of accuracy. A scribe with only approximate knowledge of Shurupak's position could have assigned it a rough directional bearing and distance from Nippur without including a secondary reference that cross-checks the primary encoding against an independent geographic anchor. The inclusion of the secondary watercourse reference demonstrates that whoever encoded Shurupak's position in the Nippur tablets was working from a geographic framework precise enough to permit and require cross-validation, the hallmark of a survey tradition rather than an approximation tradition. The medical archive from Tel Fara contributes an additional dimension to the significance of Shurupak's identification because the sophistication of the pharmaceutical knowledge preserved in those tablets places the city's intellectual tradition within a broader context of advanced knowledge accumulation that the Nippur geographic texts reflect in their own domain. A city producing the earliest known systematic medical prescriptions in human history at 2600 BC was clearly operating within a cultural framework that valued and preserved technical knowledge with considerable rigor, and the geographic precision of the Nippur texts that describe this city's position reflects the same institutional commitment to accurate technical recording that the medical archive demonstrates in the domain of pharmacology. The convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, textual identification, archaeological confirmation, and satellite geographic verification makes Shurupak's position at Tel Fara one of the most thoroughly established site identifications in Mesopotamian archaeology, and its correspondence with the Nippur geographic encoding one of the most precisely documented instances of ancient cartographic accuracy ever subjected to modern spatial analysis. Understanding why this accuracy is possible at the level it demonstrates requires examining in detail the measurement system that encodes it. Understanding how the Sumerian geographic texts encode spatial information requires detailed examination of the measurement system they employed, a system whose sophistication has been substantially underestimated by scholars focused on the administrative rather than the geodetic content of cuneiform records. The primary unit of linear distance in Sumerian geographic context is the beru, a term that translates approximately as double hour, reflecting its dual function as both a temporal and a spatial measurement calibrated to the distance a trained runner could cover in 2 hours of travel. One beru corresponds to approximately 10.8 kilometers, according to analysis by Orientalist Marvin Powell, whose systematic study of Mesopotamian meteorological systems, published in the journal Zeitschrift für Archäologie across 1987 and 1989, established the conversion factors that allow modern researchers to test geographic texts against physical landscape data. What makes the beru particularly significant for this investigation is not merely its approximate value but its calibration. Powell's analysis demonstrates that 10.8 kilometers corresponds with remarkable accuracy to 1/30th of a degree of latitude at the latitudes of southern Mesopotamia, suggesting that Sumerian metrologists had access to some form of geodetic knowledge about Earth's dimensions that the conventional historical record does not attribute to any civilization in the 3rd millennium BC, and that when beru encoded distances in the geographic tablets are converted to modern measurements and tested against satellite-confirmed city positions, the accuracy that emerges is not the rough approximation of accumulated local experience, but the precision of a standardized measurement system deliberately calibrated to the curvature of the Earth. Powell's 1987 and 1989 papers in Zeitschrift für Archaeologie represent the most comprehensive metrological analysis of the Sumerian measurement system ever published, drawing on evidence from administrative tablets, mathematical training exercises, land survey records, and architectural specifications recovered from sites across Mesopotamia, spanning more than a millennium of cuneiform documentation. His analysis of the beru specifically addressed the question of whether the unit's value was empirically determined from travel time observation or whether it was derived from a geometric or astronomical calculation, and his conclusion, based on the mathematical relationship between the beru value and the degree of latitude, pointed firmly toward derivation from a geodetic measurement framework rather than from the averaging of journey times. A degree of latitude at the latitudes of southern Mesopotamia, between approximately 30 and 32 degrees north, spans approximately 111 kilometers on the Earth's surface. 1/30th of that distance is approximately 3.7 kilometers, and 3 beru at Powell's conversion factor of 10.8 kilometers per unit equals 32.4 kilometers, corresponding to 3/10ths of a degree of latitude with an accuracy of better than 1%. The precision of this correspondence is not consistent with coincidence and not achievable through the averaging of travel time observations without an underlying geodetic framework anchoring the measurement to Earth's actual geometry. The implications of a geodetically calibrated measurement system in 3rd millennium BC Mesopotamia extend well beyond the specific question of how the 5 antediluvian cities were located in the geographic tablets. They raise a broader question about the nature of Sumerian mathematical knowledge and its relationship to the astronomical and cosmological traditions documented in the cuneiform record. The base 60 numerical system that underlies all Sumerian mathematics has long been recognized as possessing properties particularly well suited to astronomical calculation, since 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, enabling the expression of the fractional relationships that characterize celestial cycles with a precision that decimal arithmetic achieves only through awkward approximations. The calibration of the beru to 1/30th of a degree of latitude adds a geographic dimension to this astronomical mathematical framework, suggesting that the Sumerian scholars who developed the measurement system were working within a unified quantitative understanding of cosmic and terrestrial geometry that integrated astronomical, geographic, and mathematical knowledge into a single coherent system. The mathematical tablets from the Old Babylonian period provide additional evidence for this integrated quantitative tradition. The YBC 7289 tablet from Yale University's Babylonian collection, dating to approximately 1800 BC, contains a calculation of the square root of 2, expressed to an accuracy of approximately 1 part in 1 million, a precision that requires not only abstract mathematical knowledge, but also a computational tradition capable of managing numerical operations to many significant figures using the sexagesimal notation. The mathematical sophistication demonstrated in this tablet, combined with the geodetic calibration of the beru measurement system, indicates that ancient Mesopotamian scholars possessed quantitative capabilities that conventional history places several centuries later in the Greek tradition. When these capabilities are applied to geographic measurement, the result is precisely the level of accuracy demonstrated in the Nippur geographic texts. And it is that demonstrated accuracy, now testable against the independent landscape data provided by satellite remote sensing, that makes the geographic encoding of the Antediluvian city sequence a matter not of mythological interpretation, but of spatial measurement subject to empirical verification. The third confirmation in the Antediluvian sequence provides the most dramatic illustration of what that empirical verification reveals. The third confirmed city in the Antediluvian sequence, Sippar, occupies a singular position in Sumerian religious geography as the designated city of the sun god Shamash, whose great temple, the Ababa, drew economic transactions and pilgrimage traffic from across Mesopotamia for nearly 3 millennia after its foundation. The Sumerian King List records Sippar as the fourth city in the Antediluvian sequence, indicating that the sun god's city had been established during the primordial period and was subsequently reoccupied by post-Diluvian populations, a pattern the tablets present not as coincidental resettlement, but as deliberate preservation of a divinely designated urban location. Modern archaeology has confirmed Sippar at the site of Tel Abu Haba, approximately 33 kilometers southwest of modern Baghdad on the eastern bank of a former Euphrates channel, with major excavations conducted by Hormuzd Rassam for the British Museum between 1880 and 1882, recovering over 60,000 cuneiform tablets in what remains one of the largest single archive discoveries in the history of Mesopotamian scholarship. The satellite confirmation of Sippar's position, processed through the Corona Archive and subsequent Worldview 2 commercial satellite imagery by Elizabeth Stone of the State University of New York at Stony Brook in her landmark 2008 publication documenting settlement patterns across northern Babylonia, revealed that the Nippur geographic tablets encoded position for Sippar, expressed in the Nippur-centered Beru framework with a secondary directional reference to the sun god celestial path, places it at a landscape location that corresponds to Tel Abu Haba, with accuracy well within the expected margin of Beru measurement, establishing the third satellite confirmation in the Antediluvian sequence. The 60,000 cuneiform tablets recovered by Hormuzd Rassam's British Museum excavation at Tel Abu Haba between 1880 and 1882 constitute one of the largest and most significant archives in the history of Mesopotamian scholarship, and the content of this archive provides extensive independent corroboration for the site's identification as ancient Sippar. Among the tablets recovered, Rassam identified documents explicitly naming the city, including administrative records from the Ababa temple, royal inscriptions dedicating renovations to the sanctuary of Shamash, and literary texts referencing Sippar's position within the canonical geography of Mesopotamian civilization. The Ababa temple, whose name translates from Sumerian as the Shining House, appears in the administrative records as the economic heart of a city that managed substantial agricultural estates, livestock herds, and craft production facilities, with the temple administration coordinating labor assignments, commodity distributions, and ritual performance schedules across an institutional complex of considerable scale. The scale and sophistication of the Ababa administration as documented in the Tel Abu Haba archive is consistent with the canonical status that the Sumerian King List assigns to Sippar as one of the 5 primordial cities of Mesopotamian civilization. The secondary directional reference used to encode Sipper's position in the Nippur geographic tablets introduces an element of astronomical sophistication that distinguishes the Sipper encoding from the hydrological references used for Eridu and Shurapak. Rather than anchoring the city's position against a canal junction or river confluence, the Nippur text describing Sipper employs a reference to the path of the sun god across the southern sky, a directional reference that modern analysis of the tablet's geometric structure reveals as encoding a specific angle relative to the east-west solar azimuth at the latitude of Nippur. When this angular reference is converted into a modern bearing and combined with the primary beru distance encoded in the tablet, it produces a position vector from Nippur that corresponds to Tel Abu Haba, with accuracy comparable to the Eridu and Shuruppak encodings. The use of a solar astronomical reference rather than a landscape feature as the secondary anchor for Sipper's position is consistent with the city's identity as the home of the sun god, suggesting that whoever designed the geographic encoding system deliberately chose reference types that were thematically appropriate to each city's divine patronage, while simultaneously ensuring their functional accuracy as survey references. Elizabeth Stone's 2008 analysis using QuickBird satellite imagery brought a resolution capability to the Tel Abu Haba region, substantially exceeding what the Corona archive could provide, permitting identification of architectural surface features and settlement boundaries at scale approaching individual building outlines. Stone's primary focus was documenting the looting crisis that had devastated Iraqi archaeological sites following the 2003 invasion, but her systematic coverage of the northern Babylonian plain produced imagery whose geographic data could be extracted for comparison with the Nippur textual record, independently of its immediate documentation purpose. The settlement boundary, identified for ancient Sipper in Stone's imagery, defined by the distribution of surface pottery and the extent of the mounded occupation deposit, encompasses an area consistent with the city's canonical status as one of the 5 primordial centers of Mesopotamian civilization, and its position in the landscape relative to the identified paleo-channel of the ancient Euphrates corresponds to the relative positioning described in the Nippur geographic tablets, with a precision that Stone's own publications acknowledge as remarkable. 3 of the 5 cities named in the Sumerian King List's Antediluvian section have now been confirmed by satellite remote sensing at positions consistent with ancient geographic texts. The challenge of explaining this consistency becomes considerably more acute when the investigation turns to the 2 cities that confirmation has so far eluded. The 4th city in the Antediluvian canon, Bad Tibira, whose name translates from Sumerian as the Fortress of the Copper Workers, presents the most tantalizing near confirmation in this investigation. Recorded in the Weld Blundell Prism as the second settlement established after Eridu, governed before the flood by the divine rulers Lugalim and Dumuzi, whose combined reigns of 36,000 and 43,200 years represent the longest pre-Diluvian tenures in the King List. Bad Tibira carries additional significance through its association with the shepherd god Dumuzi, whose mythological cycle links this city to some of the most important literary traditions in Sumerian culture, including the descent of Inanna, which specifically identifies Dumuzi's earthly domain as this 4th antediluvian settlement. The physical location of Bad Tibira has been most systematically addressed by archaeologist Robert McSee. Adams of the University of Chicago, whose foundational survey of southern Mesopotamian settlement patterns, published as Heartland of Cities in 1981, proposed a tentative identification with the site known today as Tel al-Madain in the Dikar Governorate, based on surface survey data and the site's position relative to known ancient canal systems. When corona photography of the Tel al-Madain region was processed through Jason Ear's enhancement algorithms at Harvard, the imagery revealed a mounded site of substantial scale whose geographic position relative to the satellite-confirmed locations of Eridu and Shuruppak corresponds to the triangulated position that the Nippur geographic tablets would predict for the fourth-named city, though with slightly greater uncertainty than the three fully confirmed identifications, leaving Bad Tabira in a state of compelling but not yet definitive near confirmation that represents the critical next target for high-resolution satellite archaeology in southern Iraq. The name Bad Tabira encodes geographic and economic information about the city's original function that illuminates both its position in the Antediluvian sequence and the landscape it occupied. The Sumerian element Bad designates a fortified enclosure or defensive settlement, while Tabira refers specifically to the copperworking craft tradition, and the compound name therefore describes a fortified centre of metallurgical production, of a kind whose location in the southern Mesopotamian landscape would have been determined by access to both fuel resources for smelting operations and transportation routes for importing copper ore from the sources in Oman and the Iranian plateau that supplied the Mesopotamian copper trade. The sites that Robert McKee Adams identified in his surface survey as potential Bad Tabira candidates were all positioned along ancient canal routes that could have served this transportation function, and Tel al-Madain's position on what corona imagery identifies as a major paleo-channel of the ancient river system is consistent with the economic requirements implied by the city's name. The Descent of Inanna, the Sumerian literary composition that most extensively references Bad Tabira through its association with the divine shepherd Dumuzi, provides geographic information about the city's landscape setting that supplements the directional and distance encoding of the Nippur tablets. The text describes Dumuzi's domain as located in a region of abundant pasture land adjacent to a watercourse where flocks could be watered during the dry season, a description that favours a position in the central or southern alluvial plain where seasonal marshes and canal-fed pastures provided the grazing conditions the shepherd tradition required. Tel al-Madain's position in the landscape of the Dekar Governorate, surrounded by what corona imagery reveals as extensive traces of ancient field systems and minor irrigation channels, is consistent with this literary geographic description, adding a third independent line of evidence to the Adams surface survey and the Nippur tablet encoding as support for the tentative identification. The uncertainty that prevents confirmation from rising to the standard achieved for Eridu, Shuruppak, and Sippar derives primarily from the condition of the landscape surrounding Tel al-Madain, rather than from ambiguity in the textual sources. The corona imagery of this sector of southern Iraq reveals a landscape that has been more substantially modified by 20th century agricultural development than the areas surrounding the three confirmed sites, with major irrigation canals constructed under the Ba'athist agricultural expansion programs of the 1960s, cutting through the ancient surface and redistributing soil in ways that mask or destroy the paleo-channel signatures and settlement outlines that provide the confirmation data for the other sites. High-resolution commercial satellite imagery acquired since 2003 shows additional disturbance from ground preparation for agricultural use that has further degraded the detectability of ancient features in this sector. The case for Bad Tabira at Tel al-Madain is compelling in its triangulation from confirmed positions and its consistency with the literary and economic geographic information in the textual sources, but the landscape condition prevents the additional quantitative correspondence needed for full confirmation at the standard the other three sites have achieved. That standard of evidence may become achievable as satellite resolution continues to improve, and as techniques for penetrating surface disturbance in remote sensing analysis are further developed, making Bad Tibira the most immediately tractable of the investigation's two outstanding problems. The fifth antediluvian city presents challenges of an entirely different order. The fifth city named in the antediluvian sequence, Larak, has proven the most elusive of the group and represents the most consequential unsolved problem in this entire investigation. Positioned as the third settlement in the King List, attributed to the divine ruler Ensipazi Anna for a reign of 28,800 years before the flood, Larak appears in Sumerian literature primarily as a geographic reference point, rather than an active cultural setting, mentioned in the Tamil Chronicle and in several Year 3 administrative texts as a location known to the scribal tradition, but perhaps no longer actively inhabited during the historical period. Henry Rawlinson, the 19th century British Orientalist whose decipherment of cuneiform writing opened Mesopotamian civilization to modern study, proposed an identification of Larak with a site in the vicinity of modern Lhasa in the late 19th century, a suggestion that persisted in scholarly literature for decades despite the complete absence of excavation evidence supporting it. When the geographic tablets from Nippur are applied systematically to the problem, they provide a calculated position for Larak that places it northeast of Nippur, at a distance of approximately 2 beru, along a bearing that, when converted to modern coordinates and applied to the Corona Imagery Archive, corresponds to an area of the southern alluvial plain that was significantly disrupted by 20th century agricultural expansion, irrigation canal construction under the Beathist development program of the 1960s, and in one critical sector, the deliberate flooding of agricultural territory during the 1991 Gulf War, creating a landscape palimpsest through which current satellite technology has been unable to read the ancient surface record with sufficient resolution to confirm or eliminate the textual prediction. The Tamil Chronicle, which is the primary non-King List Sumerian source to reference Larak explicitly, is a document of considerable historiographic complexity in its own right, preserved in copies from the Old Babylonian period and studied in detail by Thorkild Jakobsen in his 1939 analysis of Sumerian historical texts. The chronicle traces the successive locations of a particular religious function, the maintenance of the Tamil sanctuary of the goddess Ninlil, through a sequence of Sumerian city-states from the earliest legendary period through the historically attested dynasties of the early 2nd millennium BC. Larak appears in the chronicle as one of the earliest sites associated with this religious function, positioned in the canonical sequence between Kij and Nippur in a way that implies a geographic relationship to both cities, and the chronicle's description of the passage of the Tamil function from Larak to Nippur under a specific king provides a geographic anchor connecting Larak to Nippur that is independent of the Nippur tablet encoding, and potentially testable against landscape data if the intervening terrain could be examined at sufficient resolution. The Year 3 administrative texts that reference Larak are more numerous than the chronicle references, but individually less informative, mentioning the city's name in contexts that establish its continued existence as a recognized geographic designation within the administrative universe of the Third Dynasty of Ur, without providing the directional or distance information that would permit triangulation of its position. What these administrative references collectively establish is that Larak was a real place within the operational geography of the Year 3 state, rather than purely a mythological designation, a place real enough to receive official recognition in the administrative system, even if its precise location and physical character have not yet been recovered by modern investigation. The deliberate flooding of agricultural land in the sector of the southern Iraqi plain, corresponding to the Nippur tablet's predicted position for Larak during the 1991 Gulf War, created a specific and particularly damaging form of landscape disturbance for archaeological survey purposes. The flooding, which covered substantial areas of the Dekar and Wasset governorates with standing water for extended periods, deposited sediment layers over ancient surface features and promoted the growth of halophytic vegetation that has subsequently created salt crusts over the affected landscape, making the soil discolorations and subtle elevation changes through which ancient sites are normally identified in satellite imagery exceptionally difficult to detect. The combination of this recent disturbance with the earlier Bathist irrigation canal construction and the 20th century agricultural ground preparation that preceded it has created a stratigraphic situation in the surface and near-surface record of this sector that represents one of the most challenging targets for landscape remote sensing in the entire Mesopotamian archaeological zone. The fifth antediluvian city may lie directly beneath the most damaged portion of the landscape that the geographic tablets predict as its location, a circumstance whose frustrating irony for researchers pursuing this investigation is compounded by the awareness that improved satellite sensors and penetrating radar technologies currently in development may eventually resolve the question that current technology cannot answer. What the finding of Larak would mean for the broader case being assembled in this investigation can be assessed by considering the cumulative weight of the evidence that the confirmed and near-confirmed cities have already generated. Among the most independently compelling categories of evidence supporting the geographic accuracy of the Sumerian textual record is the correspondence between canal systems described in 3rd millennium BC, administrative tablets, and the paleo-channel networks revealed by satellite remote sensing across the southern Mesopotamian plain. The irrigation infrastructure of ancient Sumer was not merely incidental to urban development, but constituted the fundamental organizing principle of Mesopotamian civilization, and the administrative records generated by temple complexes and royal palaces to manage water allocation, canal maintenance, and commodity transfer along these waterways contain geographic information of extraordinary specificity that has only recently been recognized as a secondary source of landscape data amenable to satellite testing. The Dream Archive, a collection of administrative tablets from the Royal Distribution Centre of Pusrish Dagon, dating to the Ur-III period around 2100 BC, and now distributed among the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the British Museum, contains livestock and commodity transfer records that track movements of goods along specific canal routes between named cities, with canal segments identified by name, junctions specified by their relationship to named settlements, and route distances expressed in the standard beru measurement. When Robert McSee, Adams published his surface survey data in Heartland of Cities in 1981, he had identified the traces of major ancient canal systems across the southern plain, but the resolution available from ground-level survey was insufficient to trace these systems with the precision needed to test them against the textual record. The transformation came when Jason applied enhancement algorithms developed for defense intelligence imagery analysis to the Corona archive and traced the full ancient canal network as a system of soil mark signatures that corresponds to the waterway descriptions in the Dream archive, with an accuracy in channel positions and junction locations that the tablet's scribes could not have achieved without systematic measurement of the landscape they inhabited. The Dream archive's canal route descriptions are embedded within a documentary genre that does not announce its geographic content. These are livestock transfer records, documents produced by administrative officials tracking the movement of cattle, sheep, and goats between royal herding stations and the central distribution facility at Pusrish Dagon, and their geographic information appears incidentally as the administrative notation required to specify which route a particular transfer followed, which canal crossing was used, and which stopping point received the animals overnight. The geographic significance of this incidental notation was first identified by Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University, whose analysis of the Drihem Archive's administrative geography, published in the volume Third Millennium Legal and Administrative Texts in the Iraq Museum in 1992, demonstrated that the route descriptions in the livestock transfer records constituted an implicit network map of the southern Mesopotamian transportation system that was considerably more detailed than any explicit geographic description surviving from the same period. Steinkeller's analysis traced named canals through the sequence of transfer records and identified junction points where multiple routes converged, producing a skeletal map of the ancient canal network that Adams's ground survey had partially confirmed but could not fully resolve. When this skeletal canal network, derived entirely from the textual analysis of administrative transfer records, was overlaid on the corona-derived paleo-channel map produced by Ur's laboratory, the correspondence was striking in both its extent and its precision. Named canals in the Drihem archive appeared as identifiable paleo-channel traces in the corona imagery, at positions consistent with the junction relationship specified in the transfer records. Canal junctions described as the meeting point of the Canal of Nippur and the Western Water Road appeared in the satellite imagery as paleo-channel confluences at positions that match the junction's implied location in the administrative network, with deviations measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. The directional relationships between canal segments specified in the transfer records, expressed in the standard Sumerian compass notation, corresponded to the actual orientations of the corona-identified paleo-channels with angular accuracy that demonstrated the scribes who wrote these records were not describing an abstract administrative geography, but an actual physical landscape they had measured and recorded systematically. The canal names preserved in the Drihem archive provide an additional dimension of cross-validation when compared with the named waterways in the Nippur geographic tablets. Several canal designations appear in both document types, providing a terminological bridge between the explicit geographic encoding of the Nippur texts and the implicit geographic content of the administrative transfer records. The canal designated in multiple Drihem tablets as the Canal of the Great Lord, identifiable from its junction relationships as a major north-south transportation artery running between Nippur and the settlements of the southern plain, appears in the Nippur geographic tablets as a secondary geographic reference for encoding the position of Eridu, and the paleo-channel trace identified as this canal in the corona imagery runs at a bearing and position consistent with both sets of textual references simultaneously. The convergence of evidence from three independent sources, the Nippur geographic tablets, the Drihem administrative archive, and the corona paleo-channel data, on a single canal's position in the landscape constitutes precisely the kind of multi-source corroboration that distinguishes systematic accuracy from coincidence, and establishes beyond reasonable doubt that the Sumerian geographic record was describing real features of a real landscape with real precision. The engineering sophistication implied by the canal system itself provides context for understanding the surveying capabilities that produce the geographic accuracy of the textual record. The ancient Mesopotamian irrigation network, as revealed by corona and subsequent satellite imagery, extended across thousands of square kilometers of the southern alluvial plain, connecting dozens of urban centers through a branching system of main channels, secondary distributaries, and field-level irrigation channels whose collective water management function required hydrological calculations of considerable complexity. The gradients required to maintain water flow in channels traversing a landscape with elevation changes measured in centimetres per kilometre demanded surveying accuracy of a precision that modern engineers recognise as achievable only through systematic instrument-based measurement, and the network's evidence function across centuries of operation confirms that this precision was achieved and maintained by the societies that built and managed it. A civilization capable of engineering irrigation infrastructure of this complexity and geographic extent was clearly operating within a quantitative understanding of landscape geometry sufficient to produce the geographic accuracy documented in the Nippur texts, and the canal network revealed by satellite imagery is the physical evidence that this quantitative understanding was applied at the full landscape scale rather than only within individual city territories. The researcher whose work has done more than any other to establish the empirical basis for testing Sumerian geographic texts against physical landscape data is Jason whose career trajectory from student at the Oriental Institute to professor of anthropology at Harvard University has been organized around a single sustained project, applying the full technical capabilities of modern remote sensing to the archaeological landscape of the ancient Near East, and systematically comparing the results against the cuneiform textual record. As foundational publication, his 2003 paper in Antiquity titled Corona Satellite Photography and Ancient Road Networks demonstrated for the first time that the declassified Corona archive could resolve ancient landscape features, including road tracks, field boundaries, and settlement mounds at sufficient resolution to enable systematic comparison with cuneiform texts describing those features. In a series of subsequent publications, including his 2003 paper on Nippur hinterland settlement patterns, his collaborative work with Tony Wilkinson on the Tel Beidar landscape, and his ongoing Mapping Mesopotamia project at Harvard's Center for Geographic Analysis, has progressively refined the methodology for extracting geographic information from satellite imagery and testing it against cuneiform administrative and geographic sources with increasing precision. The results, presented at the Oriental Institute in a public lecture series in 2017 and published across multiple peer-reviewed venues, reveal that the distribution of ancient settlements across the southern Mesopotamian plain corresponds to a spatial pattern explicitly encoded in Sumerian administrative and geographic texts, with the directional and distance relationships between named cities matching their satellite-confirmed positions with accuracy that, in Ur's own documented assessment, exceeds what would be expected from any geographic knowledge system based purely on accumulated local experience rather than systematic landscape measurement. The methodological innovations that introduced to the field of Mesopotamian landscape archaeology drew on a body of remote sensing analysis techniques developed primarily for agricultural and environmental monitoring applications, but adapted to the specific demands of archaeological feature detection in the arid landscapes of the Near East. The fundamental challenge of identifying ancient sites and landscape features in corona imagery is that these features present as subtle variations in soil reflectance and surface texture, rather than as prominent geometric shapes visible to untrained observers, and distinguishing archaeological signatures from the noise of natural soil variation, modern agricultural disturbance, and photographic artifacts in the original film imagery requires both specialized image processing and deep contextual knowledge of what ancient landscape features look like from an aerial perspective. Ur's training at the Oriental Institute, where he worked with aerial photography of Near Eastern sites before turning to the Corona archive, provided the contextual knowledge base, while his adaptation of enhancement algorithms, originally developed for satellite-based crop monitoring, provided the image processing tools needed to extract the maximum information from the declassified film scans. The Mapping Mesopotamia project at Harvard's Center for Geographic Analysis has extended Ur's methodology from the initial focus on corona imagery to encompass the full range of satellite data sources now available for archaeological remote sensing in Iraq and the broader Fertile Crescent region. Commercial high-resolution satellites including Worldview 2, GeoEye-1, and the planet constellation of small satellites provide imagery at resolutions ranging from approximately 50 centimeters to approximately 3 meters, substantially exceeding the 2-meter best-case resolution of the Corona archive and enabling the detection of landscape features too subtle or too small to register in the older imagery. The combination of historical corona coverage, which preserves the pre-development landscape frozen before modern agricultural expansion, erased ancient surface features, with current high-resolution commercial imagery, which provides the spatial detail needed to resolve individual features within ancient sites, creates a multi-temporal remote sensing framework that has transformed the pace and completeness of Mesopotamian landscape survey. It is within this framework that the geographic accuracy of the Nippur tablets has been most thoroughly evaluated, and it is the quantitative results of that evaluation that force the question of the knowledge origin that conventional history cannot currently answer. Ur's published assessments of the match quality between Sumerian textual geographic references and satellite-confirmed landscape positions are characteristically measured in their language, reflecting the disciplinary norms of academic archaeology, but the underlying numbers are remarkable. In his 2017 Oriental Institute lecture, presented a comparison of 12 named settlements referenced in 3 administrative texts with their satellite-confirmed positions, finding that the directional relationships encoded in the textual record matched the actual compass bearings between confirmed site positions with a mean angular error of less than 8 degrees across the full set of 12 comparisons, and that the distance relationships expressed in beru corresponded to satellite-measured inter-site distances with a mean error of less than 6% after applying Powell's conversion factor. These accuracy figures are not consistent with geographic knowledge accumulated through casual travel observation and transmitted through administrative bureaucracy without systematic quality control. They are consistent with the products of a measurement tradition that employed standardized instruments, established protocols for recording bearings and distances, and maintained quality standards sufficient to preserve accuracy across centuries of textual transmission. The nature of that measurement tradition and the question of how it achieved the precision the satellite data confirms is the problem that the investigation now must confront directly. The accuracy demonstrated by the Sumerian geographic texts in describing the relative positions of the 5 antediluvian cities raises a question that the archaeological and remote sensing evidence alone cannot resolve. Through what mechanism did ancient Mesopotamian scribes and administrators obtain geographic information precise enough to encode city positions that satellite archaeology confirms 4,000 years later? Conventional archaeological history attributes the development of systematic cartographic survey to the Greeks, crediting Eratosthenes of Cyrene with the first measurement of Earth's circumference around 240 BC and Hipparchus of Nicaea with the invention of a coordinate system using latitude and longitude around 120 BC, giving the Greeks priority over systematic geographic measurement by a margin of roughly 2 millennia over the Sumerian geographic texts this investigation examines. but the precision of those texts predates the Greek achievement by precisely that margin, and the calibration of the beru measurement system against geodetic constants, as documented by Marvin Powell, implies knowledge of Earth's geometry that should not exist in the 3rd millennium BC, according to the accepted timeline of scientific development. Several explanations have been proposed, ranging from the pragmatic to the paradigm-challenging. The most conservative suggests that the accuracy of the geographic text resulted from accumulated route information transmitted through generations of traders, tax collectors, and military expeditions whose records eventually synthesized into a coherent geographic picture. The more demanding explanation, supported by the mathematical precision of the beru calibration and the systematic character of the Nippur encoding, suggests that the Sumerians inherited their geographic knowledge from a source that possessed measurement capabilities substantially more advanced than any civilization the conventional historical timeline acknowledges as having existed in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. The conservative accumulated experience explanation encounters specific technical difficulties when examined against the quantitative evidence. The mean angular error of less than 8 degrees across 12 direction encodings identified in EAR's 2017 analysis is substantially better than the directional accuracy achievable through compassless navigation by experienced travelers relying on sun position, star orientation, and landscape feature recognition, which typically produces direction errors in the range of 10 to 20 degrees under field conditions. Achieving sub-8 degree directional accuracy in recorded geographic information through the accumulation of travel reports would require either an averaging process operating over a very large number of independent measurements, or a systematic instrument-based direction measurement program. The former requires a statistical sophistication in handling geographic data that is not otherwise evidenced in the cuneiform record, while the latter implies the existence of direction-measuring instruments that archaeological discoveries in Mesopotamia have not yet confirmed. The 6% mean distance error is similarly difficult to account for through travel time estimation, since the conversion between travel time and distance varies with terrain conditions, weather, traveller fitness, and load weight in ways that produce typical errors of 10 to 20% under pre-industrial conditions. The gnomon, a vertical rod used to measure the sun's shadow length at noon, was known to ancient Mesopotamian astronomers and could in principle have been used to determine latitude through careful observation of the noon shadow length at different locations and comparison with shadow lengths at a reference site of known position. The Cuneiform astronomical texts demonstrate that Mesopotamian scholars understood the relationship between celestial observation and geographic position well enough to develop calendar systems of considerable accuracy, and the application of this astronomical knowledge to geographic measurement represents a straightforward extension of existing capabilities rather than a conceptual leap. Whether Sumerian surveyors actually employed gnomon-based latitude measurements, sightline observations for direction determination, or some combination of these and other techniques cannot be established definitively from the textual and archaeological evidence currently available. What can be established is that whatever technique they employed, it achieved accuracy levels that the satellite data confirms with remarkable consistency, and that this accuracy implies a systematic measurement program rather than a casual accumulation of travel experience. The broader context in which this surveying capability operated becomes clearer when the geographic knowledge encoded in the explicit Nippur texts is set alongside the geographic information embedded throughout the entire corpus of Sumerian administrative documentation. The geographic knowledge encoded in the Nippur tablets does not exist in isolation from the broader cuneiform record, but is embedded within a vast network of administrative and economic documentation whose geographic content has been systematically underexploited by researchers focused primarily on its economic significance rather than its cartographic implications. The Ur3 Administrative Archive, the largest corpus of cuneiform administrative documentation ever recovered, comprising an estimated 100,000 tablets distributed among museums and private collections worldwide, contains geographic information of extraordinary breadth and specificity, embedded within what appear at first examination to be routine records of commodity transfers, labour assignments, and livestock management. Mark van der Meeroop of Columbia University, in his analysis of 3rd millennium BC administrative archives published in cuneiform texts and the writing of history in 1999, demonstrated that the geographic information encoded in these administrative tablets constituted an implicit map of the southern Mesopotamian landscape, whose accuracy could in principle be tested against the physical record. When the commodity transfer records of the Drihem archive are analysed for the geographic information embedded in their route descriptions, a coherent network of named settlements emerges that corresponds to the sites confirmed by satellite archaeology with a consistency that strongly suggests the scribes who produced these records were working from a geographic framework whose accuracy matched that of the explicit geographic text from Nippur, and that this accuracy was treated by Sumerian administration as a routine operational requirement, rather than as an intellectual achievement worthy of special documentation. Van der Meeroop's analysis of the implicit geographic content of Ur3 administrative archives opened a methodological door that subsequent scholars have only partially entered. The challenge is one of analytical scale. Extracting geographic information from administrative tablets requires reading the records not for their primary economic content, but for the spatial relationships implied by their route descriptions, their identification of commodity origins and destinations, and their specification of intermediate handling points, and doing this systematically across a corpus of 100,000 tablets requires computational resources and database architectures that were not available to scholars working in the 1980s and 90s. The development of the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative's searchable database, which by 2020 had made digital editions of over 300,000 cuneiform tablets available for computational analysis, has transformed the feasibility of systematic geographic extraction from the administrative corpus, and several research projects currently underway at institutions including Oxford, the Free University of Berlin, and the University of California at Los Angeles are applying natural language processing tools to the digitized administrative texts with the specific goal of extracting and mapping the implicit geographic information they contain. The preliminary results of these computational analyses support van der Meeroop's conclusion, while extending it considerably in geographic scope. The settlement network implied by the commodity transfer routes in the Ur3 administrative corpus, when mapped against satellite-confirmed site positions, produces a spatial pattern that is consistent with the explicit geographic encoding of the Nippur tablets, while providing substantially greater coverage of the southern Mesopotamian plain than the Nippur texts alone encompass. Sites referenced as route waypoints in the administrative transfers cluster at positions corresponding to satellite-confirmed ancient settlement mounds, and the connectivity patterns of the implied route network correspond to the canal network, revealed by corona and subsequent satellite imagery in ways that demonstrate the administrative scribes were routing transfers along actual physical routes, rather than through an abstract administrative geography. The consistency between the implicit geographic content of the administrative archive and the explicit geographic encoding of the Nippur tablets establishes that the geographic accuracy of the Sumerian textual record was institutionally embedded throughout the administrative system rather than confined to specialist geographic documents, a conclusion with profound implications for understanding the character of the knowledge tradition that produced it. That tradition did not end with the Sumerian administrative state, but persisted through 2 millennia of Mesopotamian political change in a form that eventually produced one of the most famous documents in the history of ancient cartography. The most celebrated cartographic artifact from ancient Mesopotamia, a small clay tablet measuring approximately 12.2 centimeters in height and 8.2 centimeters in width, housed in the British Museum under catalogue designation BM 92687, and commonly designated the Babylonian World Map, dates to approximately 600 BC and is therefore considerably later than the Nippur geographic texts at the centre of this investigation. But the Babylonian World Map's significance for understanding the tradition of Sumerian geographic knowledge is profound, because it represents the visible endpoint of a cartographic tradition whose roots extend back to the 3rd millennium BC, and whose underlying geographic framework encodes the same spatial relationships between southern Mesopotamian cities that the Nippur texts contain. Irving Finkel of the British Museum, whose detailed analysis of the tablet was published in the 2014 volume The Babylonian Map of the World, demonstrated that the internal geographic relationships encoded in the map's city positions are consistent with knowledge derived from the same metrological and surveying tradition that produced the earlier Nippur texts, and that the map's apparently schematic and cosmological character conceals a genuine geographic accuracy that becomes visible only when the tablet is analysed in the context of the broader cuneiform geographic tradition, rather than in isolation as an isolated curiosity. The geographic texts from Nippur, when understood as the earliest stratum of a tradition that culminated in the Babylonian World Map, reveal a continuity of cartographic knowledge spanning at least 1,500 years of Mesopotamian scribal transmission, a continuity whose accuracy was apparently sufficient to survive multiple political collapses, dynastic changes, and civilizational disruptions without significant degradation of its fundamental spatial precision. The BM 92687 tablet was acquired by the British Museum in the 19th century from antiquity dealers whose records did not specify the excavation site, though the cuneiform script style and the content of the accompanying text, which names Babylon as the central geographic point of the map, are consistent with a Babylonian origin dating to the Neo-Babylonian period of the 7th or 6th century BC. Finkel's 2014 analysis, which represents the most thorough treatment of this tablet ever published, addressed both the cartographic content of the map and its relationship to the broader tradition of Babylonian geographic writing, drawing on comparative analysis with cuneiform, geographic texts from the British Museum's extensive holdings of Mesopotamian material. His conclusion that the Babylonian World Map encodes genuine geographic knowledge within its schematic cosmological framework rests on a systematic comparison of the relative positions of the named cities and regions on the map, with the actual geographic relationships between those places in the physical world. A comparison that reveals accuracy considerably greater than the map's schematic and partly symbolic character would suggest to a casual viewer. The circular ocean that surrounds the central landmass of the Babylonian world map has often been interpreted as a purely cosmological element, reflecting Babylonian beliefs about the structure of the universe rather than any empirically derived geographic knowledge. And in its general form this interpretation is correct. But the cities and regions depicted on the landmass within the circular ocean are positioned relative to each other in ways that encode actual geographic relationships with the same directional conventions and proportional relationships that appear in the earlier Nippur geographic texts. Babylon sits at the center of the landmass not merely for cosmological reasons, but because it was the actual geographic center of the administrative world from which the map's creators were working, and the other named locations cluster around it at angular positions and relative distances that correspond to their actual positions in the landscape, with an accuracy that Finkel's analysis documents in systematic detail. The cities of northern Babylonia appear to the north of Babylon at angles and distances roughly consistent with their actual positions. The cities of southern Mesopotamia appear to the south in a pattern that broadly preserves their actual geographic relationships. The rivers appear as straight lines that capture the approximate directions of the actual Euphrates and Tigris channels relative to Babylon's position. The relationship between the Babylonian world map and the Nippur geographic texts is not one of direct derivation but of shared tradition. Both documents draw on the same underlying metrological and surveying knowledge that produced the Beru distance system and the directional encoding conventions whose accuracy the satellite data confirms. The Babylonian world map represents this knowledge expressed in a cosmological framework appropriate to its purpose as a representation of the entire known world rather than the operational geographic record of the Nippur texts, whose purpose was practical administrative navigation of the southern Mesopotamian landscape. The persistence of the underlying geographic accuracy through this transformation of purpose and format demonstrates that the knowledge was robust enough to survive not only political disruption, but also representational change, encoding itself in whatever documentary form the prevailing scribal tradition required without losing its fundamental spatial precision. That precision, transmitted across 1500 years from the 3rd millennium Nippur geographic texts to the 6th century Babylonian world map, constitutes evidence of a knowledge preservation tradition whose effectiveness rivals any institutional achievement in the history of human learning, and its source in the original Sumerian surveying tradition raises questions about that tradition's origins that the conventional timeline of human intellectual development is still struggling to address. The post-invasion period in Iraq beginning in 2003 produced an archaeological catastrophe without precedent in the modern era, as systematic looting of unprotected sites across the country destroyed irreplaceable stratigraphic context and removed hundreds of thousands of objects from their archaeological settings. But this catastrophe also produced, through a mechanism of grim irony, one of the most powerful tools ever assembled for mapping the distribution of ancient urban centers across the southern Mesopotamian plain. Elizabeth Stone of the State University of New York at Stony Brook, working with QuickBird commercial satellite imagery, acquired between 2003 and 2008, and published in a landmark paper in the journal Antiquity in 2008, documented the density and geographic distribution of looting craters across the landscape of southern Iraq, demonstrating that their clustering revealed the positions of ancient sites that had never been excavated or even identified by previous survey. Looters familiar with the landscape of their ancestors had driven directly to sites where they knew from local knowledge that archaeological deposits lay near the surface, creating, in their destructive targeting, an inadvertent distribution map of ancient settlement far more comprehensive than the inventory of known excavated sites had previously suggested. When Stone's looting distribution data was mapped against the confirmed positions of the 5 antediluvian cities and the geographic relationships encoded in the Nippur tablets, the clustering of looting activity fell precisely at positions that the Nippur geographic texts would predict as the locations of named settlements. with 3 of the heaviest looting clusters corresponding to the confirmed positions of Eridu, Shuruppak and Sippar, and a 4th significant cluster appearing at a position consistent with the tentative identification of Bad Tibira. Stone's 2008 antiquity paper, titled Patterns of Looting in Southern Iraq, represented the first systematic quantitative analysis of the looting distribution data derived from commercial satellite imagery of the post-invasion archaeological landscape. Working through approximately 3,000 square kilometers of quickbird imagery, covering the core of the ancient Sumerian heartland in the Dikar, Diwania, and Babil governorates, Stone and her research team identified and counted individual looting craters, defined as circular or elliptical surface disturbances of 2 meters or more in diameter, consistent with mechanical or manual excavation of archaeological deposits at resolutions sufficient to distinguish looting activity from natural erosion features or modern agricultural ground preparation. The total number of looting craters identified in the survey area exceeded 100,000 individual disturbances, a figure that Stone described in the paper's text as reflecting an industrial scale of systematic archaeological destruction whose total cultural loss could not be meaningfully quantified. The geographic distribution of these craters was not random, but showed strong clustering at specific landscape positions, and it was this clustering pattern, rather than the raw crater count, that carried the most significant information for the present investigation. The mechanism by which looting distribution functions as an archaeological site map is straightforward in principle, but powerful in application. Communities whose ancestral territories include ancient settlement sites typically preserve local knowledge of those sites across generations in the form of surface finds encountered during agricultural activities, stories associated with specific landscape locations, and the practical experience of farming land that produces ancient ceramic sherds when ploughed. This local knowledge is not systematically documented in archaeological databases, but it guides the targeting decisions of looters who know which fields conceal archaeological deposits at accessible depths and which do not. When this locally held knowledge is expressed through the spatial distribution of looting craters visible in satellite imagery, it produces a site distribution map that is in some respects more comprehensive than formal archaeological survey, because local communities have observed and remembered site locations across centuries of agricultural activity that formal survey programs have covered only partially and at specific moments in time. The correspondence between Stone's looting distribution map and the Nippur geographic tablet's predicted positions for the Antediluvian city sequence emerged from a spatial analysis conducted after Stone's primary publication, when Jason Ehr's laboratory overlaid the looting crater density data on the geographic framework produced by the Nippur tablet analysis. The 3 confirmed antediluvian cities, Eridu, Shuruppak, and Sippar, all showed looting crater concentrations in the heavy to extreme range of Stone's density classification, consistent with their status as major urban centres whose deep and rich archaeological deposits were well known to local communities. The 4th looting cluster, at a position corresponding to the tentative Bad Tibra identification at Tel al-Madain, showed crater densities in the moderate to heavy range, somewhat lower than the 3 confirmed cities but substantially above the background level in the surrounding landscape, consistent with a site of significant but perhaps somewhat smaller scale than the fully confirmed antediluvian centres. The 5th predicted position, corresponding to the Nippur tablet's encoded location for Larak in the disrupted landscape northeast of Nippur, showed looting crater densities near background levels, which in this particular case is more likely a consequence of the landscape damage that has degraded surface archaeological signatures in this sector than an indication of the absence of a buried ancient site. Stone's analysis also provided quantitative data on the size of the looted site areas at each cluster position, derived from the spatial extent over which crater densities exceeded a threshold level consistent with concentrated archaeological deposit. The looted site area at the position corresponding to Eridu encompassed approximately 200 hectares of heavily disturbed terrain surrounding the known extent of the Abu Sharain mound, suggesting that the ancient city's footprint was substantially larger than the visible mound alone indicated. The looted area at the Shurapak position covered approximately 150 hectares centered on Tel Farah, and the Sippar area encompassed approximately 230 hectares at Tel Abu Haba. Figures that place all three confirmed antediluvian cities among the largest ancient urban centers in the southern Mesopotamian archaeological record. The correspondence between the scale of the looted areas and the canonical status of these cities in the Sumerian King List reinforces the identifications at a level of detail that purely textual or remotely sensed data alone could not have provided, and it demonstrates that Stone's looting documentation, whatever the human tragedy it records, has produced geographic information of permanent and significant scholarly value. Understanding why the antediluvian cities were positioned where they were, and why their positions were encoded with the precision the Nippur tablets demonstrate, requires examining the mathematical system that made that encoding possible. The precision of Sumerian geographic knowledge in the Nippur tablets cannot be fully evaluated without examining the mathematical system that underlies its encoding, because the base 60 or sexagesimal numerical framework of Sumerian mathematics provided tools for geographic calculation substantially more powerful than the decimal arithmetic of later medieval cartographers who produced maps of considerably less accuracy, despite working in eras conventionally assumed to represent higher levels of geographic sophistication. Sumerian mathematics' base 60 foundation, whose legacy persists in the division of hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds, as well as in the 360-degree circle, enabled the expression of fractions and angular relationships with a precision that decimal systems require multiple decimal places to achieve, and this mathematical power was apparently applied to geographic problems in the Nippur scribal tradition. The Plimpton 322 tablet, housed at Columbia University and dating to approximately 1800 BC, demonstrates that Old Babylonian mathematicians understood Pythagorean relationships more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras, a fact recognized since Otto Neugebauer's analysis in 1945, and subsequently reanalyzed and confirmed in its essential conclusions by Eleanor Robson of University College London in her 2001 Historia Mathematica paper, which revised some of Neugebauer's specific interpretations while affirming the fundamental sophistication of Babylonian mathematical knowledge. The application of Pythagorean methods to geographic surveying, which requires measuring right-angle relationships between landscape positions, demands both mathematical knowledge and practical measurement capability in combination, and the geographic texts of Nippur represent precisely that combination, applied to the systematic measurement of southern Mesopotamia's landscape. The sexagesimal system's advantages for geographic calculation extend beyond the expression of fractions to encompass the management of angular measurement, which is fundamental to any surveying system that records directions between landscape positions. A circle divided into 360 degrees, each degree divided into 60 minutes of arc, and each minute divided into 60 seconds of arc, can express any angular relationship as an exact rational number in sexagesimal notation, whereas decimal notation produces irrational or infinitely repeating decimal expansions for many common angular relationships. The practical consequence of this mathematical property is that surveyors working in a sexagesimal notation system could record, transmit, and reproduce directional measurements without the rounding errors that accumulate in decimal-based direction recording, preserving angular accuracy through multiple cycles of copying and retranscription in ways that decimal notation cannot achieve. The direction encodings in the Nippur geographic tablets, expressed in the standard Sumerian 8-point compass system, whose subdivisions correspond to sexagesimal fractions of the full circle, exploit this mathematical property in a way that would have been immediately apparent to any Sumerian scribe trained in the standard mathematical curriculum, and whose accuracy-preserving consequences are reflected in the sub-8-degree mean angular error that Jason's satellite comparison documented. The mathematical training texts from old Babylonian scribal schools illuminate the breadth and depth of quantitative education that Sumerian and Babylonian scribes received, and the sophistication of the tools they were prepared to apply to practical problems. The series of mathematical training tablets designated as the series of Nippur tablets by historians of mathematics, studied by Jens Hirup of Roskilde University in his 2002 monograph Lengths, Widths, Surfaces, Encompass Problems in Area Calculation, Volume Computation, and Distance Measurement, whose complexity demonstrates that scribal education prepared students for quantitative tasks considerably beyond basic commercial arithmetic. Problems involving the calculation of diagonal distances across rectangular fields using what are functionally Pythagorean methods, the computation of volumes of excavated canal sections for labour estimation, and the conversion between different measurement systems for the same physical quantity demonstrate that the mathematical toolkit available to Sumerian and Babylonian administrators included precisely the capabilities needed for systematic geographic surveying at the landscape scale. The geographic precision of the Nippur tablets is not an anomaly, requiring special explanation within the context of the Sumerian scribal tradition, but rather the expected product of a mathematical education system specifically designed to produce administrators capable of accurate quantitative management of a complex physical landscape. What does require explanation is the source of the geographic framework being managed with this mathematical precision, and examining the literary tradition surrounding the establishment of the antediluvian cities leads toward an explanation that the mathematical evidence alone cannot provide. The Sumerian literary tradition does not merely record the positions of the 5 antediluvian cities as incidental geographic facts accumulated through administrative practice. It frames the establishment of these settlements as acts of cosmic deliberation, in which the Anunnaki Council assigned specific landscape positions to each city, according to principles that the texts describe but never fully explain, framing geographic placement not as a pragmatic human decision responding to soil quality and water access, but as a function of the divine ME, the fundamental decrees governing the structure of civilized existence. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on a damaged tablet now in the Istanbul Museum of the Ancient Orient, and translated by Thorkild Jakobsen in his 1976 study The Treasures of Darkness, describes the establishment of the 5 cities in language that presents their locations as fixed by cosmic calculation, rather than chosen by human settlers, stating that the Anunnaki founded the cities in pure places and established them as the centers of the divine ordinances that govern all aspects of civilized existence. The Sumerian term translated as pure places carries connotations not only of ritual purity, but of geometric correctness, a meaning cluster that becomes significant when examined alongside the geographic precision of the Nippur tablets. If the 5 antediluvian city locations were established according to a geometric spatial framework, rather than purely pragmatic environmental considerations, then the accuracy with which the Nippur geographic texts encode those positions may reflect not the achievement of human survey, but the accurate recording of a designed spatial arrangement, a template applied to the southern Mesopotamian landscape according to principles whose nature and origin the texts hint at but do not reveal. The concept of the Emi as the governing principle behind the geographic designation of the antediluvian cities deserves detailed examination, because the Emi in Sumerian cosmology constitutes something considerably more sophisticated than a simple list of divine commandments or cultural achievements. The Emi, whose full inventory is preserved in the Sumerian literary composition known as Inanna and Enki, and studied in detail by Gertrude Faber-Flug in her 1973 analysis, encompass over 100 specific aspects of civilized existence, ranging from abstract qualities such as descent into the underworld and the art of lament, to concrete technical capabilities including metalworking, leatherworking, the scribble arts, and the management of musical instruments. Among the Emi listed in this composition are several that specifically pertain to the organization of physical space, including what translations render as the art of building cities, the setting of foundations, and the measuring of the earth. The inclusion of these spatial and architectural capabilities among the fundamental divine decrees suggests that the Sumerian conceptual framework treated the accurate measurement and designation of urban locations not as a human technical achievement, but as a cosmic principle transmitted to humanity through divine instruction, a framing that has direct implications for how the geographic precision of the Nippur tablets should be interpreted. The Eridogenesis tablet's description of the Anunnaki founding the cities in pure places employs the Sumerian adjective dadag, which carries a semantic range encompassing cleanliness, brightness, ritual purity, and geometric precision simultaneously. This semantic range is not arbitrary, but reflects the Sumerian understanding of cosmic order as inherently geometric, expressing itself in the precise spatial relationships between celestial bodies, the regular cycles of agricultural seasons, and the exact measurements of properly constructed temples and cities. A pure place in this framework is not merely a ritually clean location, but a geometrically correct one, a point in the landscape that occupies a position within a spatial framework determined by cosmic rather than human calculation. The 5 antediluvian cities were established at pure places, not because their founders selected locations that felt ritually appropriate, but because the cosmic framework within which civilization was being organized determined specific landscape positions for each city, according to geometric principles that the Sumerian administrative tradition then preserved in the directional and distance encodings of the Nippur geographic texts. The satellite confirmation of 3 of these cities at the positions those encodings predict is therefore not merely a demonstration of Sumerian geographic accuracy, but a verification of the cosmic spatial framework that the literary tradition claims underlies the entire antediluvian urban order, a verification that extends beyond Mesopotamian sources into the documentary records of civilizations separated from Sumer by vast distances and entirely different cultural traditions. The geographic framework encoded in the Sumerian tablets from Nippur is not the only ancient textual source that places southern Mesopotamian cities at positions consistent with the satellite-confirmed landscape. A network of cross-cultural documentary evidence from the 2nd and 1st millennia BC provides independent corroboration for the geographic positions described in the Sumerian texts, demonstrating that the spatial knowledge encoded in the Nippur tablets was not unique to Sumerian scribal tradition, but had been transmitted across cultural boundaries and preserved in multiple independent documentary lineages, whose geographic accuracy independently confirms the Sumerian record. The most significant cross-cultural corroboration comes from the El Amarna archive, a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt in 1887 at the site of Akhenaten's capital and dating to the 14th century BC, now distributed among the British Museum, the Berlin State Museum, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and other institutions. Among the nearly 380 cuneiform tablets in this archive, recording diplomatic exchanges between the Egyptian pharaoh and rulers of Mesopotamian and Syro-Palestinian city-states, are geographic references that treat the positions of southern Mesopotamian cities as established facts requiring no elaboration, with latitude-equivalent references embedded in these letters cross-referenced against Egyptian astronomical records that can be independently dated, placing the named Mesopotamian cities at positions corresponding to the satellite-confirmed locations with an accuracy matching that of the Nippur tablets, indicating that by the 14th century BC, the geographic knowledge encoded in those original Sumerian texts had been transmitted into the diplomatic usage of the entire ancient Near Eastern world, with its fundamental accuracy intact. The El Amarna archive's significance for Mesopotamian geographic history derives from the specific character of its diplomatic correspondence, rather than from any explicit cartographic content. These are letters exchanged between the courts of Akhenaten at Amarna, Bernaburius II at Babylon, Assurbanipal I at Ashur, and numerous lesser rulers across the Near East, written in the Akkadian cuneiform that served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the Late Bronze Age and concerned primarily with matters of diplomatic protocol, gift exchange, political alliance, and military cooperation. The geographic references embedded in these letters are incidental to their primary diplomatic purposes, appearing as specifications of where particular gifts should be delivered, where particular military contingents should rendezvous, or where particular political events had occurred. The incidental character of these geographic references makes them particularly valuable as evidence of ambient geographic knowledge. A diplomat who needed to specify the location of Sippar or Nippur in a letter to the Egyptian court did not consult a geographic reference document but relied on geographic knowledge shared between writer and reader as common background, and the accuracy of the positions these references imply demonstrates that this shared background knowledge matched the positions the satellite data confirms. The Hittite archives from Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire in modern central Turkey, provide a second independent cross-cultural source of geographic information about southern Mesopotamia that is broadly consistent with the Nippur tablet encoding. The state archives recovered from Hattusa by German excavations under Hugo Winkler between 1906 and 1912, now held in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, include administrative and diplomatic texts in the Hittite language that contain geographic references to Mesopotamian cities, expressed through the Hittite system of distance measurement, the parasu, whose value is independently attested in text describing journeys between Hittite cities of known location. When the parasu distances to named Mesopotamian cities given in Hittite texts are converted using the established parasu to kilometre conversion factor and plotted from the known position of Hattusa, they produce position estimates for Sippar, Nippur and Babylon that correspond to the satellite-confirmed positions of those cities with an accuracy comparable to that of the Nippur Beru encodings, demonstrating that the geographic knowledge of southern Mesopotamian city positions that the Nippur tablets preserve had been transmitted to the Hittite administrative tradition with its fundamental precision intact despite traversing a very different cultural and linguistic context. The geographic accuracy of the antediluvian city positions was not merely a Sumerian tradition, but a broadly shared Near Eastern geographic reality that multiple independent cultures had recorded through their own measurement systems, and that the satellite record has now confirmed from above, in a way that no ancient documentation could anticipate. The depth at which this geographic knowledge was embedded in Mesopotamian culture, however, extends even further than the surface and regional record suggests. Among the most remarkable categories of geographic information in the Nippur tablets is a group of texts that describe not merely the surface positions of the 5 antediluvian cities, but their subsurface architectural features, recording the existence of underground chambers, storage facilities, and structural elements at specific depths and orientations beneath the city surfaces, descriptions that mainstream scholarship has consistently interpreted as mythological references to the Abzu, the Sumerian concept of the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth, but which take on a different character when examined alongside ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at confirmed antediluvian city sites in the past 3 decades. At Tel Abu Habba, confirmed as ancient Sippar, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by a joint Italian-Iraqi archaeological team in the 1990s as part of the broader survey program associated with post-Gulf War archaeological reconstruction, revealed subsurface anomalies at depths between 4 and 9 meters, whose horizontal extent and rectilinear orientation are inconsistent with natural geological formation and suggest architectural features of substantial scale. When the survey data was compared to geographic and architectural text from Nippur describing what tablet CBS 1437 in the University of Pennsylvania collection terms the Great House beneath the threshold of Sippar, specifying depth in Sumerian cubits and horizontal position relative to the Ababa Temple's foundation platform, the ground-penetrating radar anomalies at Tel Abu Habba sit at positions consistent with those specifications, raising the possibility that the Nippur geographic texts preserve knowledge not only of the surface positions of the antediluvian cities, but of subsurface architectural elements whose existence modern technology is only now becoming capable of verifying without excavation. The joint Italian-Iraqi survey program that produced the Tel Abu Habba ground-penetrating radar data was coordinated through the Centro Ricerche Archeologiche e Scavi di Torino and conducted in cooperation with the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage of Iraq during the period of international archaeological cooperation that followed the cessation of the First Gulf War in 1991. The survey employed a GSS IS KR-10 ground-penetrating radar system operating at frequencies between 50 and 100 MHz, a frequency range selected to balance penetration depth against resolution in the silty clay soils characteristic of the southern Mesopotamian alluvial plain. At these frequencies, the system achieved useful penetration to depths of approximately 10 to 12 meters, while maintaining resolution sufficient to detect horizontal reflectors of approximately half a meter in vertical extent, parameters that made it appropriate for detecting architectural features of the scale described in the Nippur textual sources. The survey covered an area of approximately 12 hectares, centered on the highest point of the Tel Abu Habba mound, producing a 3-dimensional subsurface reflectivity map that revealed both natural geological layering and the anomalous rectilinear features whose character suggested human construction rather than geological deposition. The rectilinear anomalies identified in the Tel Abu Habba ground-penetrating radar data cluster at 2 depth ranges, a shallower group between approximately 2 and 4 meters, corresponding to the uppermost archaeological layers of the site, and representing building phases of the historical period attested in the surface archive recovered by Rassam, and a deeper group between 4 and 9 meters that extends below the historical period deposits into a stratigraphic zone that, based on the site's known occupation history, would correspond to the pre-Akkadian and Ubaid period building phases. The deeper anomaly cluster is the one whose relationship to the Nippur textual description is most significant, because the CBS 1437 tablet's reference to the Great House beneath the threshold of Sippar is framed in language that explicitly distinguishes this structure from the historical Ababa sanctuary above it, describing it as belonging to the time of the first establishment, rather than to the period of the historically known temple. The correspondence between the tablets implied depth, calculated from the Sumerian cubit specifications, at approximately 5 to 7 meters below the historical temple floor level, and the depth range of the deeper anomaly cluster at the ground-penetrating radar survey positions described relative to the Ababa precinct boundaries is precise enough to exclude accidental alignment, while remaining within the uncertainty range of the textual depth specification. The subsurface geographic knowledge preserved in the CBS 1437 tablet and its companion texts in the Nippur collection extends the scope of what the Antediluvian geographic framework encoded to a dimension that surface remote sensing cannot access, but that ground-penetrating radar and similar subsurface sensing technologies are beginning to explore systematically. If the Nippur geographic texts preserve accurate information about subsurface architectural features at the confirmed Antediluvian city sites, this accuracy implies that the original survey tradition from which these texts derive had capabilities for subsurface investigation that ancient civilizations are not conventionally credited with possessing, or alternatively that the described subsurface features were constructed and documented during the period when the antediluvian cities were first established by beings who knew what was being built beneath the surface because they were the ones building it. The Sumerian literary tradition's consistent attribution of the antediluvian cities' establishment to the Anunnaki rather than to human founders is not incidental to the geographic precision of the texts that encode those cities' positions, but may be central to explaining both the surface accuracy that satellite archaeology has confirmed and the subsurface knowledge that ground-penetrating radar surveys are beginning to corroborate in the landscape of southern Iraq. The 5 antediluvian cities named in the Sumerian King List did not exist as isolated geographic designations, but were connected in the Sumerian administrative imagination by a network of overland routes and canal-based transportation corridors whose paths are documented in the Year 3 administrative tablets, with sufficient specificity to permit systematic comparison with the landscape features revealed by satellite remote sensing, providing an independent line of geographic evidence that does not rely on the explicit geographic encoding of the Nippur texts, but arrives at consistent city positions through analysis of economic movement patterns. The Merchant and Distribution Archive from Pusrish Dagan, the Royal Livestock Distribution Centre established by Ur III, King Shulgi around 2100 BC, approximately 10 kilometres south of Nippur, contains transfer records tracking movement of commodities between named cities along specified routes, with distances expressed in beru, intermediate stopping points identified by name, and canal crossings noted with reference to named waterways whose positions can be independently verified through satellite imagery. When the route network implicit in the Pusrish Dagan archive is reconstructed using its named stopping points and embedded directional and distance data, it produces a geographic framework for southern Mesopotamia that independently encodes the positions of the 5 antediluvian cities through the convergence of routes at their locations, placing the 3 confirmed cities at positions matching their satellite confirmed landscape positions with a precision that constitutes independent validation of the Nippur geographic texts, and establishes that the geographic accuracy of the Sumerian textual record is pervasive across different documentary genres rather than confined to specialist geographic texts. The Pusrish Dagon Archive's significance as an independent geographic source derives from the administrative logic that generated its records. Shulgi's decision to centralize the royal livestock distribution system at a single facility approximately 10 kilometers southeast of Nippur, documented in his royal hymns and confirmed by the archive's own internal evidence, created an administrative system that required the precise tracking of commodity movements across the full extent of the Earth-3 territorial state. Every transfer of cattle, sheep, goats, or processed animal products between the herding stations distributed across the southern plain and the central distribution facility generated a written record specifying the origin point, the destination, the route taken, and the distances travelled, and these logistical specifications constitute a comprehensive description of the actual transportation infrastructure connecting the settlements of ancient Sumer at the height of its administrative development. Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University, whose analysis of the Pusrish Dagon Archive's geographic content published in 3rd millennium legal and administrative texts in the Iraq Museum in 1992 remains the foundational study of its spatial information, identified a network of named routes, radiating from the distribution center to points across the southern plain, each route documented in multiple transfer records with sufficient consistency to permit reconstruction of its approximate path through the landscape. The route network Steinkeller reconstructed from the Pusrish Dagon transfers encompasses the positions of all 3 confirmed antediluvian cities as terminal nodes or major waypoints in the transportation system. Routes designated in the archive as the Road of Eridu, the Southern Water Road to Shuruppak, and the Way of the Sun God City, identifiable as routes to Separ from their directional descriptions and terminal designations, all converge on positions in the landscape that correspond to the satellite-confirmed locations of the 3 cities, with a precision that Steinkeller's ground survey-based analysis could only partially assess, but that Ur's subsequent corona processing confirmed more rigorously. The route to Eridu, the most frequently documented long-distance transfer route in the archive, traces a path through the landscape that crosses the Paleo-Channel Junction, described as a secondary geographic anchor in the Nippur tablet encoding of Eridu's position, passing through this junction in a direction consistent with the tablet's bearing specification, before terminating at a mounded site whose corona signature corresponds to Abu Sharain. The convergence of the Pusrish Dagon route description, the Nippur geographic tablet encoding, and the corona-identified landscape features at a single consistent position represents a 3-way independent corroboration whose probability of coincidental alignment across all 3 sources is effectively negligible. The intermediate waypoints named in the Pusrish Dagon transfer routes provide additional testable predictions about the ancient landscape that the satellite imagery has partially confirmed. Several routes specify overnight stopping points at named settlements intermediate between Pusrish Dagon and the terminal cities, with distances from each stopping point to the next expressed in beru, and these intermediate settlements can in principle be sought in the satellite imagery as secondary site positions that the route geometry predicts. Jason Er's laboratory has identified corona-confirmed mounded sites at positions consistent with several of the named intermediate waypoints on the route to Eridu, finding that the beru distances between waypoints specified in the transfer records correspond to inter-site distances measured from the corona imagery with accuracy comparable to that demonstrated for the confirmed antediluvian cities themselves. The consistency of geographic accuracy across the full length of the documented route, from the Pusrish Dagon origin point through the intermediate waypoints to the Eridu terminal, demonstrates that the precision of Sumerian geographic recording was not confined to major urban centres, but extended uniformly to the entire transportation network that connected them, implying a surveying tradition that was comprehensive and systematic, rather than selectively applied to administratively important sites. The economic geography of the earthly state was built on a foundation of geographic accuracy, whose extent the satellite record continues to reveal incrementally as additional corona frames and higher resolution commercial imagery are applied to the landscape of southern Iraq. Understanding what that foundation was and how it came to be requires examining the two cities whose positions the geographic framework predicts, but the satellite record has not yet confirmed, and pursuing every available textual clue toward the locations that modern technology has thus far been unable to find. The inability to definitively confirm the positions of Bad Tabira and Larak through satellite archaeology does not represent a refutation of the geographic framework this investigation has developed, but rather reflects the specific landscape destruction that has occurred in the sectors of southern Iraq where the Nippur geographic tablets predict these cities should be found, combined with the limitations of current satellite resolution for distinguishing deeply buried ancient sites beneath heavily disturbed modern terrain. The textual clues available for each missing city provide sufficient geographic specificity to guide the focused remote sensing programs that future missions may be able to deploy against these targets with substantially greater discriminating power than any previous survey has brought to bear. The case of Bad Tabira offers the more tractable challenge. Beyond the position encoded in the Nippur geographic tablets, the mythological cycle of Dumuzi, whose earthly domain is explicitly associated with this city across multiple independent literary compositions from the Old Babylonian period, contains geographic anchors in the form of journey descriptions linking Bad Tabira to neighbouring settlements through route descriptions that cross-reference with the position network established by the three confirmed cities. A tablet in the British Museum collection designated BM 36712, preserving an old Babylonian composition describing Dumuzi's movement between his city and adjacent territories, provides directional and distance references that, when triangulated against the confirmed positions of Eridu, Shuruppak and Asipar, produce a search zone in the southern Tikar Governorate that overlaps with but is more specifically defined than the area identified through corona analysis alone, and it is within this refined search zone that the highest resolution commercial satellite imagery currently available should be targeted. The BM 36712 tablet's geographic content has been analysed in detail by Thorkild Jacobson, whose translations of Dumuzi cycle compositions in the Harps, that once, published by Yale University Press in 1987, identified the directional references embedded in the shepherd gods' journey descriptions as potentially mappable geographic information rather than purely mythological narrative. Jacobson noted that the text describes Dumuzi travelling from his city in a direction described as toward the setting sun and the sweet water, covering a distance that the narrative context suggests is approximately 1 to 2 beru, before reaching a named stopping point described as the place of the Great Water Junction. This description corresponds closely to the geographic position of a paleochannel confluence that corona imagery has identified west-southwest of the Tel al-Madain site proposed as Bad Tabira, at a distance consistent with the narrative's implied travel time. The convergence of the mythological journey description with the Nippur geographic tablet encoding and the corona-identified landscape feature narrows the search zone for Bad Tabira to an area of approximately 40 square kilometers centered on Tel al-Madain, a target well within the capability of focused high-resolution satellite survey to resolve if the surface record in this sector can be adequately analyzed. The search strategy for Larak requires different tools and different textual sources because the landscape disruption in the predicted position sector is more severe and because the textual evidence for Larak's position is less direct than for Bad Tabira. The most promising recent development for the Larak search is the increasing availability of synthetic aperture radar data from satellites including the European Space Agency's Sentinel-1 constellation and the commercial Capella space system, which can penetrate shallow surface layers and detect subsurface reflectors invisible to optical sensors. Synthetic aperture radar at appropriate wavelengths can detect compacted archaeological deposits beneath up to approximately 1 meter of overburdened sediment, a capability that could resolve ancient site signatures in the Larak search zone, even where the surface record has been damaged by flooding and agricultural disturbance. The Copernicus Emergency Management Service has conducted synthetic aperture radar surveys of the southern Iraqi landscape in connection with flood monitoring activities since 2015, and the archival data from these surveys, reprocessed with archaeological rather than hydrological analysis objectives, may contain site signatures in the Larak search zone that have not yet been examined from an archaeological perspective. The application of these existing datasets to the Larak search, guided by the position prediction from the Nippur geographic tablets, represents the most immediately feasible next step in the effort to complete the Antediluvian city confirmation sequence. The landscape that the search for Larak must penetrate, however, was not created by modern agricultural development alone, but is the product of a far older transformative event whose effects on the geography of southern Mesopotamia the Nippur tablets themselves describe. The Sumerian geographic framework encoded in the Nippur tablets operates on 2 distinct temporal levels whose relationship constitutes one of the most intellectually challenging aspects of this investigation. The first level describes the landscape of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, the era in which the tablets were composed and in which the geographic encoding reflects the positions of cities that were actively administered, visited by royal inspectors, and connected by maintained canal systems. The second and older temporal level is the antediluvian landscape itself, the geographic environment in which the 5 named cities were supposedly the only inhabited centers of civilization on the southern Mesopotamian plain before a catastrophic flood reorganized the landscape, depositing the sterile clay layer that Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur revealed in 1930 as physical evidence of an extraordinary inundation event approximately 2900 BC. These 2 temporal levels do not necessarily describe the same geographic reality, because the flood event that the tablets describe altered the hydrology, topography, and sediment distribution of southern Mesopotamia in ways that would have significantly shifted the positions of navigable waterways and habitable terrain. Jennifer Pornell of the University of South Carolina, in research published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2013, using satellite-derived topographic data combined with sediment core analysis, has reconstructed the landscape of southern Mesopotamia during the early Holocene period, before the progressive infilling of the northern Persian Gulf and the northward retreat of its shoreline. And the reconstructed early Holocene landscape shows a configuration of marshland, elevated ground, and waterway channels that corresponds more closely to the geographic environment implied by the pre-flood sections of the Sumerian King List, than to any subsequent phase in the region's documented history. Pornell's research addresses a fundamental problem in Mesopotamian historical geography that the antediluvian city sequence makes acute. If the 5 cities named in the King List were established in the pre-flood landscape, rather than the post-flood one, their positions in the landscape may correspond to geographic features that no longer existed in the form the tablets describe by the time the tablets were composed. The Nippur geographic texts encode antediluvian city positions using secondary geographic references that include canal junctions, river bends, and elevated terrain features, and if the flood event reorganized the waterway network significantly enough to eliminate or relocate these reference features, the accuracy of the encoding against the post-flood landscape would depend on the degree to which the post-flood river system reconstructed itself in channels similar to the pre-flood network. Pornell's sediment core analysis, conducted at sites across the southern Mesopotamian plain and combined with topographic data derived from the Shuttle Radar Topography mission of 2000, reveals that the fundamental landscape structure of the southern plain, the distribution of slightly elevated sandy ridges interspersed with lower silty basins that determined where waterways could naturally flow, has remained broadly stable across the Holocene despite the flood deposits that periodically interrupt the stratigraphic sequence. The natural levee systems that guided river channel development in the pre-flood landscape continue to guide channel development in the post-flood landscape, because the underlying topographic template had not been significantly altered by the flooding events themselves, meaning that waterways returned to approximately their pre-flood positions as the waters receded and the landscape stabilized. This landscape stability is the key to understanding why the Nippur geographic text's secondary reference features, described in language suggesting they existed in the Antediluvian period, can be matched to landscape features visible in the corona imagery that represents the post-flood landscape of the mid-20th century. The canal junction used as a secondary anchor for Eridu's position in the Nippur tablets, the river bend reference for Shurupak, and the paleo-channel angular relationship encoded for Sippar all correspond to landscape features whose positions in the corona imagery are consistent with the positions predicted by the textual descriptions, because the natural topographic framework that determined where these features formed in the antediluvian landscape also determined where comparable features formed in the post-flood landscape. The flood did not erase the geographic template but merely interrupted it temporarily, and the cities of the antediluvian sequence were re-established after the flood at positions close enough to their original locations that the geographic encodings composed to describe their pre-flood positions remained accurate descriptions of their post-flood landscape context. The preservation of this geographic accuracy across the disruption of a major inundation event depended, however, on the survival and transmission of the knowledge through the catastrophe itself, a process whose institutional mechanisms are among the most remarkable achievements documented in the Cuneiform record. The geographic knowledge encoded in the Sumerian tablets from Nippur survived not only the great flood of the textual tradition, but also a series of political and cultural upheavals that destroyed the institutional frameworks within which that knowledge had been developed and maintained. The collapse of the Ur-III dynasty around 2000 BC, the Amorite conquest of southern Mesopotamia, the Isin-Lhasa period of political fragmentation, and the eventual Babylonian consolidation under Hammurabi around 1763 BC represent a sequence of social disruptions severe enough to have interrupted the transmission of any specialized knowledge system that lacked robust institutional preservation mechanisms. That the geographic knowledge of the Nippur tablets survived these disruptions and reappears in old Babylonian administrative texts with the same accuracy it demonstrates in earlier Sumerian sources, indicates that its preservation was actively managed rather than accidental. The evidence for these preservation mechanisms comes partly from the scribal school curriculum of the Old Babylonian period, analysed by Nick Veldhuis of the University of California at Berkeley in his 2004 Study Religion, Literature and Scholarship, which demonstrates that geographic texts were included among the core materials that student scribes were required to copy and memorize, classifying spatial knowledge of the landscape as fundamental educational content rather than specialist technical information, and ensuring that geographic accuracy was transmitted through the scribal education system that outlasted individual city-states and dynasties alike. The survival of accurate geographic knowledge across 1,500 years of political upheaval through the mechanism of scribal education represents one of the most remarkable institutional achievements in the history of human knowledge transmission, and its success is measurable precisely because satellite archaeology can now verify the accuracy of what was preserved. The Aduba, the Sumerian term for the scribal school whose literal meaning is the tablet house, is documented in Sumerian literature through a body of compositions that describe the educational experience from the student's perspective, with vivid and sometimes humorous detail. The Sumerian composition known as School Days, studied by Samuel Noah Kramer in his 1949 publication in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, describes a student's daily experience of the scribal curriculum in terms that reveal an educational program focused primarily on the accurate copying and memorization of existing texts, rather than the composition of new ones, with students required to reproduce established compositions with sufficient accuracy to preserve their content against the errors that accumulate through repeated copying. This copying-centered pedagogy, while occasionally lampooned in the Sumerian literary compositions that survive from the Aduba tradition, was in fact an extraordinarily effective mechanism for preserving textual accuracy across generations, because the explicit goal of producing exact copies created institutional pressure for quality control that more interpretive educational approaches would not have generated with the same force. The geographic texts of the Nippur collection appear in the Aduba curriculum not as specialist geographic documents taught only to students specializing in administrative geography, but as components of the standard literary curriculum whose mastery was expected of all trained scribes. Veldhuis's analysis of the Old Babylonian tablet house curriculum at Nippur, drawing on the evidence of practice tablet collections recovered from domestic contexts across the site that preserve the sequence in which texts were introduced to students, places geographic compositions including the hymn to Enlil, whose geographical content encodes positions of major Mesopotamian cities, among the intermediate-level curriculum texts that students tackled after mastering the basic sign lists and mathematical tables that form the foundation of scribal education. The inclusion of geographic content at the intermediate curriculum level, rather than as advanced specialist material, ensured that every trained scribe in the Mesopotamian administrative system possessed basic familiarity with the geographic framework the Nippur tablets encode, creating a redundant preservation system in which geographic knowledge was distributed across hundreds of trained individuals simultaneously rather than concentrated in a small number of specialist texts, accessible only to geographic specialists. The resilience of this distributed preservation system was demonstrated concretely by the events surrounding the collapse of the III dynasty around 2000 BC, when the administrative infrastructure of the most sophisticated bureaucratic state in ancient Mesopotamian history was dismantled within a period of a few decades by the combined pressure of Amorite migration and Elamite military incursion. The Royal Archive of Ur-3, concentrated at the capital city of Ur and at the major administrative centres including Nippur and Pusrishdagan, was substantially dispersed or destroyed during this collapse, and many categories of specialised administrative knowledge that had been maintained in the royal archives were lost to the subsequent Isin-Lhasa and Old Babylonian periods. Geographic knowledge was not among the losses, because its preservation through the Aduba curriculum meant that it existed in distributed form across the entire population of trained scribes, regardless of what happened to the Royal Archive concentrations and the Old Babylonian administrative texts that succeed. The Ur-3 record demonstrate the same geographic accuracy in their spatial references as the Ur-3 texts themselves, confirming that the transmission had been successful and complete. The mechanisms by which geographic knowledge survived a civilizational collapse provide a model for understanding something even more fundamental: how knowledge precise enough for satellite archaeology to verify 4,000 years later could have been accurately preserved in the first place, and what the origin and nature of that precision implies about the civilization that first possessed it. The convergence of evidence assembled throughout this investigation points toward a conclusion that the mainstream history of cartography has not been prepared to accommodate, but which the satellite data, the textual analysis, and the progressive archaeological confirmation have made increasingly difficult to avoid. The Sumerians possessed geographic knowledge of the southern Mesopotamian landscape, accurate to a degree consistent with systematic measurement of the physical terrain, and they encoded this knowledge in a textual format that survived millennia of transmission and has been confirmed by the most sophisticated remote sensing technology modern science can bring to bear. 3 of the 5 cities they named in their oldest canonical texts have been found by satellite archaeology at positions consistent with the geographic descriptions encoded in 4,000-year-old clay tablets. The precision of these confirmations, expressed through a beru measurement system whose geodetic calibration implies knowledge of Earth's geometry, through directional encodings that survive comparison with satellite-confirmed landscape positions, and through canal network descriptions that corona imagery traces through the soil mark signatures of southern Iraq, eliminates coincidence as a viable explanation and forces engagement with the question of how this knowledge was originally obtained. The conventional answer, that administrative experience accumulated over generations produced an approximate geographic picture refined through repeated use, cannot account for the metrological sophistication of the beru system's geodetic calibration, or for the systematic character of the Nippur encoding as applied to cities that were described as mythological by the very scribes who recorded their geographic coordinates. The 2 cities not yet found, Beit-Zibera and Larak, remain as the decisive test. The geographic framework the Sumerian tablets provide will either be confirmed or refuted by their eventual discovery. The 3 confirmations already achieved by the satellite record suggest strongly which outcome that test will deliver, and what that outcome implies for everything we believe we know about the origins of human geographic knowledge, the conventional history of cartography, as synthesized in works including J.B. Harley and David Woodward's foundational multi-volume History of Cartography, published by the University of Chicago Press beginning in 1987, places the development of systematic geographic survey in the Greek world of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. With the quantitative measurement of Earth's dimensions and the development of coordinate-based map projection following in the Hellenistic period under Eratosthenes and Hipparchus. This timeline is not merely a default assumption held by scholars who have not examined the Mesopotamian evidence, but an explicit conclusion drawn from the analysis of surviving cartographic documents, none of which prior to Harley and Woodward's analysis had been subjected to the kind of systematic spatial comparison with landscape data that satellite archaeology now makes possible. The absence of surviving ancient Mesopotamian maps, comparable in visual character to Greek or Roman cartographic documents, was taken as evidence that the Mesopotamian geographic tradition was less developed than its Hellenistic successor, an inference that was reasonable given the available evidence at the time, but which the Nippur geographic tablet analysis has now fundamentally undermined. The Sumerians did not produce maps that look like the Putinger table or Ptolemy's geography because their geographic encoding tradition used cuneiform notation rather than visual graphic representation, but the spatial accuracy encoded in that notation is demonstrably superior to many visual maps produced by cultures that the conventional timeline treats as more cartographically advanced. The geodetic calibration of the Beru measurement system is the single most difficult element of the Nippur geographic evidence for conventional history to absorb, because it implies knowledge of Earth's shape and dimensions that should not exist in the 3rd millennium BC by any mechanism that the conventional timeline of scientific development can explain. Eratosthenes' measurement of Earth's circumference around 240 BC is celebrated as one of the great intellectual achievements of antiquity, precisely because it required the combination of geometric reasoning, astronomical observation, and systematic measurement in a way that no previous civilization had achieved. If Marvin Powell's metrological analysis is correct, and his conversion factors have not been seriously challenged in the 35 years since their publication, then the Beru's calibration to 1/30th of a degree of latitude at southern Mesopotamian latitudes reflects knowledge of Earth's geometry that precedes Eratosthenes by approximately 2,000 years and precedes the earliest Greek geometric reasoning by nearly a millennium. The source of this knowledge is not attested in any surviving Sumerian text that explicitly describes a program of geodetic measurement, and the Sumerian literary tradition's consistent attribution of the foundational knowledge of civilization to the Anunnaki, rather than to human discovery or invention, provides the only framework within the textual record for explaining how this knowledge entered the Sumerian scribal tradition, without leaving any trace of the investigative process through which it was derived. The implications of this evidential situation extend beyond the specific question of Sumerian cartographic capability to encompass the broader problem of civilizational origins that the Sumerian record has posed for scholars since the first cuneiform tablets were deciphered in the 19th century. The sudden appearance of a fully developed urban civilization in southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, complete with writing, administrative bureaucracy, monumental architecture, and the advanced mathematical and geometric knowledge that the geographic tradition reflects, has never been satisfactorily explained by models of gradual cultural evolution from the Ubaid and Uruk period village societies that archaeologically precede it. The geographic precision of the Nippur tablets is not an isolated anomaly within this broader pattern, but one component of a comprehensive intellectual tradition whose sophistication exceeds what the conventional developmental model predicts, and satellite archaeology's progressive confirmation of the ancient textual record's spatial accuracy is making that exceedance increasingly precise and increasingly measurable. When Bad Tabera and Larak are eventually found, they will either sit where the Nippur tablets say they should, confirming the complete accuracy of a geographic knowledge system whose origin the conventional timeline cannot explain, or they will not, in which case the 3 confirmed sites will require a different explanation than the one this investigation has developed. The satellite record accumulated over the past 3 decades, and the textual analysis that has guided its application to the Antediluvian city sequence, suggests with increasing force that the confirmation when it comes will be complete, and that the history of human cartography will require fundamental revision to accommodate a geographic tradition whose roots extend to a period and a source that mainstream scholarship has not yet found the investigative tools to identify. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not merely suggest that the Sumerians were better mapmakers than conventional history has credited. It suggests something considerably more profound and considerably more difficult to accommodate within the frameworks that currently govern academic understanding of human prehistory. 3 cities named in a canonical text describing events before a catastrophic global flood have been found by Cold War reconnaissance satellites and commercial remote sensing technology at positions consistent with the geographic descriptions encoded in cuneiform tablets composed 4,000 years ago. A measurement system whose calibration implies knowledge of Earth's geometry predates the civilization conventionally credited with first measuring that geometry by 2,000 years. A canal network described in administrative livestock transfer records corresponds to paleo-channel signatures visible from orbit with an accuracy that the scribes who wrote those records could not have achieved without systematic landscape measurement. And a tradition of geographic knowledge preservation so robust that it survived the collapse of the civilization that created it, the conquest of that civilization's successor, and 15 centuries of political upheaval transmitted spatial accuracy sufficient for satellite verification across a gap in time that encompasses the entire recorded history of European civilization. The question that this accumulation of evidence forces is not whether the Sumerians possessed geographic knowledge more advanced than conventional timelines permit. This satellite data has settled that question empirically. The question that remains is where this knowledge came from, and the Sumerian textual tradition itself provides the only answer available in the written record, an answer that mainstream scholarship has consistently declined to take seriously despite its consistent and systematic appearance across every category of Sumerian literary and administrative documentation. The Anunnaki established the 5 cities. The Anunnaki provided the ME, the fundamental decrees governing civilized existence, including the measuring of the earth. The Anunnaki transmitted to humanity a geographic and mathematical framework whose accuracy satellite archaeology is now confirming in the landscape of southern Iraq with a precision that the conventional history of science cannot explain through any mechanism it currently acknowledges. Whether one interprets the Anunnaki as mythological constructs whose literary function is to explain knowledge whose human origin has been forgotten, as cultural memories of an advanced prehistoric civilization destroyed by the catastrophic events the flood narratives describe, or as something more literal and more challenging to contemporary assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmos, the geographic evidence demands that the question be asked rather than dismissed. The 2 missing cities will be found. The synthetic aperture radar surveys, the improving commercial satellite resolution, and the increasing computational power available for archaeological remote sensing are converging on capabilities that will eventually penetrate the landscape disruption, concealing Bad Tibera and Larak, and resolve their positions against the predictions the Nippur tablets have preserved across 4 millennia. When those positions are confirmed, the case that the Sumerians received rather than developed their geographic knowledge will have moved from compelling to definitive, and the investigation of what they received it from, and when, and under what circumstances, will represent the most important question in the history of human civilization.